The Widow's Gamble, when survival means marrying a stranger. Margaret Ward's ranch was dying, her creditors circling like vultures when she made the most desperate decision of her life. She married a drifter she'd known for 3 days. No courtship, no promises. Just a contract signed in blood and desperation. But on their first morning as husband and wife, when she woke to find him already working before dawn, she realized she'd either saved her life or invited her destruction. Welcome to Red Creek, Montana, 1885, where love is a luxury and survival is the only currency that matters. Follow this story to its stunning conclusion and comment below with your city so I can see how far Margaret and Caleb's journey has traveled across the world. The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing that morning, carrying with it the smell of pine and the promise of more snow. Margaret Ward stood on the sagging porch of her ranch house, watching the eastern horizon turn from black to gray, and felt the familiar weight of dread settle in her chest. 28 years old, widowed for 8 months, and broke in every way that mattered. The ranch that her husband Thomas had built with his own hands was falling apart. She could see it in the missing shingles on the barn roof, in the fence posts leaning at drunken angles, in the way the cattle had thinned from 40 head to barely 20. But worse than the physical decay was the invisible rot, the debt that grew like a cancer, the whispers in town, the way men looked at her now with a mixture of pity and calculation. She wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold and tried not to think about the letter folded in her apron pocket. The bank was giving her until the end of March, 6 weeks. After that, everything Thomas had worked for would belong to Harold Griswold, the land speculator who'd been circling her property like a crow around carrion since the day they'd buried her husband. The coffee on the stove had gone cold. Margaret didn't bother reheating it. She'd learned to tolerate cold coffee, stale bread, and 100 other small indignities over the past months. What she couldn't tolerate was losing the ranch. It was all she had left of Thomas, all she had left of the life they'd been building together before the fever took him. A sound from the barn made her turn. For a moment, her heart leapt. Some foolish part of her still expected to see Thomas emerge from the shadows, his broad shoulders blocking the early light, his familiar voice calling out a greeting. But Thomas was 6 feet under at the edge of the property, beneath a simple wooden cross that was already starting to weather. The figure that emerged from the barn was thinner, taller, moving with a different kind of grace. Caleb, the stranger she'd hired 5 days ago after finding him half-starved at the edge of her property, mending her fence without being asked. Margaret still wasn't sure what had possessed her to offer him work. Maybe it was the way he'd looked up at her approach, wary but not hostile, tired but not defeated. Maybe it was the quality of his fence work, neat and solid, better than anything she could have managed herself. Or maybe it was simply the desperate recognition that she couldn't do this alone anymore. She'd offered him food and a place in the bunkhouse in exchange for labor. He'd accepted with a single nod, no questions asked. For 5 days he'd worked from dawn until well past dark, speaking rarely, eating little, keeping his distance. She knew nothing about him except that his hands were skilled, his work ethic was relentless, and something had carved lines of old pain into his face that made him look older than his years. He was carrying water buckets from the well now, his breath fogging in the cold air. Even from a distance, she could see the careful way he moved, conserving energy like a man who'd learned not to waste anything. When he saw her watching, he set down the buckets and approached the porch. "Mrs. Ward." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so old-fashioned it made something in her chest twist. "Waterline to the barn's frozen solid. I'll need to start a fire underneath to thaw it out." His voice was low and careful, the accent marking him as someone who'd come from farther east. Virginia, maybe, or Tennessee. One of those places the war had hollowed out and left to rot. "Do what you need to do," Margaret said. She hesitated, then added, "There's cold biscuits inside if you want them." "Already ate, ma'am." "Thank you." He turned to go, but Margaret heard herself speak again. "Caleb." He stopped, waiting. "Why are you here?" It wasn't the question she'd meant to ask. She'd meant to ask something practical, where he'd learned fence work, whether he knew anything about cattle, how long he planned to stay. But what came out instead was the real question, the one that had been gnawing at her since she'd found him on her property. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, His voice carried a weight that made her think of Thomas's voice in those final feverish hours, trying to say things there wasn't time to say. "I was heading west to nowhere in particular, ma'am. Your fence needed mending. Seemed like a sign I should stop moving for a while." Running from something? Running toward something, maybe, or just trying to figure out what that something might be. It wasn't really an answer, but Margaret found she didn't mind. She had secrets of her own, after all, dreams she'd buried alongside her husband, plans that had died in the face of reality. "The work's steady if you want to stay on through spring," she said. "I can't pay much, but the food's regular and the bunkhouse is warm enough." Something shifted in his expression, not quite relief, but close to it. "I'd appreciate that, Mrs. Ward." He went back to his work, and Margaret turned toward the house. She had account books to review, though she knew what they'd tell her. The numbers never got better, no matter how many times she added them up. The debt grew, the cattle dwindled, and time ran out a little more each day. Inside, the house felt too large and too empty, the way it always did now. She'd grown up in a crowded tenement in Philadelphia, surrounded by the noise and smell of too many people living too close together. When Thomas had brought her west, the space had seemed like a gift. All this land, all this sky, all this possibility. Now it just felt like an absence, a void that echoed with everything she'd lost. She forced herself to sit at the kitchen table, to open the account book, to face the numbers. $57 in outstanding credit at the general store. $80 owed to the blacksmith. $340 due to the bank by the end of March, plus interest. Against that, she had 20 head of cattle that might fetch $8 each if she could get them to market, 12 chickens, half a vegetable garden that hadn't frozen, and a house and land that Griswold would happily take for a fraction of their worth. The arithmetic was brutal and unforgiving. She was drowning, and she could see the bottom coming up fast. A knock at the door made her jump. Through the window, she could see Pastor Morrison's buggy in the yard. Margaret suppressed a groan. The pastor meant well, but his visits were never simple social calls. He came bearing advice she didn't want and solutions that always seemed to involve her accepting charity or selling out to Griswold. "Mrs. Ward," Morrison tipped his hat as she opened the door. He was a small man with kind eyes and the permanent stoop of someone who'd spent his life bowing to other people's troubles. "Might I come in for a moment?" She wanted to say no, to close the door against whatever he'd come to say. But small-town courtesy was ironclad, and refusing the pastor would only add to the gossip already swirling around her. She stepped aside and let him enter. "Coffee?" she offered, reaching for the pot. "Please don't trouble yourself, my dear. I won't take much of your time." He settled into a chair at the kitchen table, his eyes lingering on the open account book. "I wanted to check on how you're managing. The congregation has been concerned. Translation? Everyone in Red Creek had been talking about her, speculating about how long she could hold out, making bets on when she'd have to sell. "I'm managing fine, Pastor." "I'm glad to hear it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I also heard you've taken on a hired man, a stranger, from what I understand." And there it was, the real reason for his visit. Someone had seen Caleb, and the gossip had started spreading like wildfire. A widow living alone with a hired man, even with the proper distance of separate buildings between them, was enough to set every tongue in town wagging. "He's a worker," Margaret said, keeping her voice level. "The ranch needs the help." "I'm sure that's true. But you must consider appearances, my dear. A young widow, a strange man. People will talk." "People are already talking, Pastor. They've been talking since the day we buried Thomas. At least now I have someone to help me keep the ranch running." Morrison sighed. "Margaret, please. I'm not trying to judge you. I'm trying to help. The fact is, a woman alone can't run a ranch. It's not proper. It's not safe. And frankly, it's not possible. The land is too hard. The work is too demanding. Thomas knew that. He would want you to be practical." "Thomas would want me to keep the ranch. Thomas would want you to be taken care of." The pastor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "Harold Griswold has made you a very generous offer, enough to clear your debts and leave you with a nest egg. You could go back east, start fresh, maybe find—" He caught himself. "Maybe find a new situation." A new situation. That was pastor speak for finding another husband, preferably one who could provide for her properly. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. I'm not interested in Mr. Griswold's offer. Then consider the other alternative. Morrison hesitated, then pushed forward. Samuel Fletcher lost his wife last year. He's a good man, established, with a thriving farm just south of town. He's expressed interest in you. Margaret remembered Samuel Fletcher, a thick-necked man in his 50s with tobacco-stained teeth and 3 half-grown children who looked at her with the same calculating interest their father did. She'd seen that look before, at church socials and in town. Men sizing her up like she was livestock, trying to determine if she was worth the trouble of acquiring. I'm not a horse to be traded, Pastor. Of course not, but you must be realistic. You have no family, no resources, and no prospects. Marriage is the sensible solution. It's what any reasonable woman in your position would consider. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting. Any reasonable woman. As if wanting to keep her own land, her own independence, her own life made her unreasonable. As if Thomas's death had somehow revoked her right to make her own decisions. Margaret stood, her hands flat on the table. Thank you for your concern, Pastor, but I'll find my own way forward. Morrison rose as well, his expression sad. I pray you will, my dear. But pride is a sin, and stubbornness can lead to ruin. Think about what I've said. She showed him out, watching as his buggy rattled back down the road toward town. When she turned back to the house, she found Caleb standing by the barn, pretending to work on a bridle while clearly having observed the entire exchange. Their eyes met across the yard. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried no judgment, no advice, no pressure. Then he went back to his work, and Margaret felt something in her chest ease slightly. At least one person in this godforsaken territory wasn't trying to manage her life for her. The rest of the day passed in hard work. Margaret mucked out stalls, fed the chickens, and spent 2 hours trying to repair a leak in the kitchen roof. Every task felt like pushing back against an inevitable tide. The ranch was dying by inches, and she was just one woman trying to hold back the ocean with her bare hands. By evening, exhaustion had settled into her bones. She made a simple dinner, beans and cornbread, and ate alone at the kitchen table, listening to the wind howl outside. Through the window, she could see a light burning in the bunkhouse. Caleb was probably reading by lamplight, or mending his few possessions, or doing whatever it was solitary men did in the long hours between sunset and sleep. She found herself wondering about him again, where he'd come from, what had driven him to her door, whether he'd stay longer than a few weeks before the wanderlust took him again. The knock on her door came just after dark. When she opened it, Caleb stood on the porch, hat in hand. Sorry to disturb you, ma'am, but there's something you need to see. His tone made her grab her shawl without asking questions. She followed him across the yard to the fence line where he pointed to a section of posts that had been deliberately cut, not broken by weather or animals, but sawn through cleanly about 6 inches above the ground. Found it on my evening rounds, Caleb said quietly. Fresh cuts. Happened today, probably while we were both working close to the house. Margaret's blood went cold. Sabotage. Someone had deliberately damaged her property, trying to let the cattle scatter, or worse. Any idea who? She asked, though she already knew. Can't say for certain, but I found wagon tracks heading back toward the main road. Heavy rig, like a freight hauler might use. Griswold. It had to be Griswold, or one of his men. Trying to speed up her inevitable collapse, to make sure she had no choice but to sell. I can repair it tonight, Caleb said. Set up a watch rotation for the next few nights. Make sure it doesn't happen again. Margaret shook her head. You can't stay up all night and work all day. You'll kill yourself. With respect, ma'am, you can't afford not to watch the property. One more incident like this and you won't have a herd left to sell. He was right, and they both knew it. Margaret stared at the cut posts, feeling the trap closing around her. She could report it to the sheriff, but Sheriff Coleman was Griswold's cousin. She could try to guard the property herself, but she couldn't be everywhere at once. She was outmanned, outmaneuvered, and out of time. I'll take the first watch, she said. You get some sleep and spell me at midnight. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded. Yes, ma'am. That night, Margaret sat in the barn with Thomas's old rifle across her lap, watching the darkness beyond the fence line. The temperature dropped steadily, and even with her heaviest coat, she shivered. Every sound made her jump, wind rattling the barn door, cattle shifting in their sleep, the distant howl of a coyote. At midnight exactly, Caleb appeared in the barn doorway. "Anything?" he asked. "Nothing." Margaret stood, her legs stiff from sitting. "Your turn." He took the rifle from her hands, their fingers brushing briefly. "Mrs. Ward, whatever's happening here, you're not facing it alone, not anymore." She wanted to tell him not to make promises. Hired men drifted away. People left. Everyone eventually left, one way or another. But she was too tired to argue, and some small, desperate part of her wanted to believe him. "Thank you," she said, and walked back to the house through the freezing dark. Sleep came hard that night. When it did, Margaret dreamed of Thomas, alive and whole, working in the field. But when she called out to him, he turned around and it wasn't Thomas at all. It was Caleb, his face marked with old scars and new determination, standing in the place her husband had once stood. She woke before dawn, disoriented and unsettled. The dream clung to her like cobwebs, carrying meanings she didn't want to examine too closely. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten. Another day was starting, another day of fighting to keep what was hers. In the barn, she found Caleb asleep, sitting up, the rifle still in his hands. He'd stayed awake all night. When he heard her footsteps, his eyes snapped open, alert immediately, no drowsy transition from sleep to waking. A soldier's reflex. "Morning, ma'am." "You should have woken me at 4 like we discussed. Didn't seem right to disturb you when nothing was happening." Margaret wanted to be angry, but she was too tired. "Go get some real sleep. I'll handle the morning chores." For once, he didn't argue. She watched him walk back to the bunkhouse, his steps dragging with exhaustion, and felt a pang of guilt. He was working himself to death for her sake. For wages she could barely afford to pay, for a ranch that probably wouldn't exist in 2 months. The morning was brutally cold, the kind of cold that made every breath hurt. Margaret forced herself through the familiar routines, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, checking the cattle, hauling water from the well. Every task took twice as long in this weather, and by the time she finished, the sun was high and her hands were raw despite her gloves. She was heading back to the house when she saw the rider coming up the road. Even at a distance, she recognized Harold Griswold's distinctive black horse and expensive saddle. Her stomach dropped. Griswold dismounted in her yard with the casual confidence of a man who expected to own everything he looked at. He was 55, well-fed, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people in Red Creek made in a year. His smile was practiced and entirely without warmth. "Mrs. Ward, good morning to you." "Mr. Griswold." She didn't invite him in, didn't offer any of the usual courtesies. They both knew what he was here for. "I wanted to check on you after the unfortunate incident with your fence. Word travels fast in a small town." So he knew about the sabotage. Of course he did. He'd probably ordered it himself. "The fence is repaired," Margaret said coldly. "I'm glad to hear it, though it does seem to highlight the challenges you're facing. A woman alone, trying to manage property that really requires a man's hand." He paused, letting the words sink in. "My offer still stands, Mrs. Ward. In fact, given your recent difficulties, I'm prepared to be even more generous. $350, cash money, for the land and buildings. That's well above market value. The ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price." Griswold's smile never wavered. "Be reasonable. You're in debt, your property's deteriorating, and you're down to barely 20 head of cattle. How much longer can you hold out? Until spring? Summer? Eventually, the bank will foreclose, and you'll get nothing. At least my offer lets you walk away with dignity and a fresh start." "I said no." "Then you're a fool." The smile finally dropped. "I've been patient with you out of respect for Thomas's memory. But my patience has limits, Mrs. Ward. One way or another, I will own this land. The only question is whether you benefit from the transaction or not." Margaret's hand moved to her pocket, where she could feel the small weight of the derringer she'd started carrying after Thomas died. Griswold saw the gesture and laughed. "No need for dramatics. I'm not threatening you. I'm stating facts. The bank wants its money by month's end. You don't have it. The arithmetic is simple. He remounted his horse, looking down at her from his superior position. Think about my offer, Mrs. Ward, before it's too late. He rode away, and Margaret stood in the yard shaking, not with fear, but with rage. The sheer arrogance of the man, coming to her property to tell her she'd already lost, to suggest she should surrender gracefully to the inevitable. But what if he was right? What if she was just being stubborn, clinging to a dream that was already dead? Thomas would have found a way out, some clever solution she couldn't see. Thomas had been good at that, at seeing angles, finding possibilities, turning problems into opportunities. She was just good at surviving, at enduring, at refusing to quit even when quitting would be smarter. Ma'am? She turned to find Caleb standing behind her, his face carefully neutral. He'd obviously witnessed the entire exchange. How much of that did you hear? Enough. He was quiet for a moment. Is it true? About the bank? Margaret nodded, too tired to lie. End of March. $340 plus interest. I've got maybe $60 worth of cattle I could sell and no other income. She waited for him to say something, to offer sympathy or advice, or to announce he'd be moving on before the whole enterprise collapsed. Instead, he asked a question that surprised her. What would it take to save the place? A miracle. Or about $300 I don't have. What if you had help, real help, not just hired labor? Margaret shook her head. I can't ask. You're not asking. I'm offering. Caleb met her eyes directly. What if there was a way to keep the ranch, satisfy the bank, and get Griswold off your back all at once? There isn't. There might be. He took a breath, and Margaret saw something flicker across his face, determination mixed with fear. The bank won't extend credit to a widow, but they might extend it to a married couple, especially if the husband brought in his own stake. It took her a moment to understand what he was suggesting. When she did, she actually laughed, a short, bitter sound. You want me to marry you? We've known each other less than a week. I want you to keep your ranch. Marriage is just a legal arrangement, a contract that benefits both parties. And what exactly do you get out of this contract? A place to stop running, a purpose, a chance to build something instead of just tearing myself apart. His voice was steady, but she could hear the undercurrent of desperation. I've got $200 saved. It's not much, but combined with what you could raise from selling some cattle, it might be enough to satisfy the bank for now. Give us breathing room to make the ranch profitable again. $200. Margaret tried to process what he was saying. He'd been half-starved when she found him, working for food and shelter, yet somehow he'd saved $200. It didn't make sense unless... That money's yours, she said slowly. You earned it. Why would you risk it on a failing ranch and a woman you barely know? Because I've got nothing else worth risking it on. He looked past her toward the fields, the mountains, the vast empty sky. I spent 4 years fighting in a war that destroyed everything I cared about. Spent another decade drifting, trying to outrun ghosts. Maybe this is where I'm supposed to stop. Maybe this is what I'm supposed to fight for now. It was insane. It was desperate. It was possibly the worst idea either of them had ever considered. And yet, Margaret thought about Pastor Morrison's visit, about Samuel Fletcher and his tobacco-stained teeth, about Griswold's smug certainty that she'd already lost. She thought about Thomas and the dreams they'd built together, now crumbling to dust. She thought about the ranch, her home, her last connection to everything she'd fought for. This would be a business arrangement, she said carefully. Nothing more. Understood. Separate quarters. No expectations of anything beyond the legal formalities. Yes, ma'am. And if it doesn't work, if the ranch fails anyway, you get your money back first, before any other debts are settled. Caleb shook his head. If the ranch fails, I fail with it. We're partners, or nothing. Partners. The word hung between them, strange and fragile. Margaret had been Thomas's partner once, but that had been built on love and years of courtship. This would be built on desperation and a mutual need to survive. But maybe survival was enough. Maybe survival was all anyone could ask for in this hard country. I need to think about it, she said finally. Of course. But Mrs. Ward, don't think too long. Griswold's not going to wait, and neither will the bank. He left her standing in the yard, her mind spinning with impossible calculations. Could she really do this? Could she marry a stranger to save her ranch? What would people say? What would Thomas think? But Thomas was dead, and she was alive, and the ranch was all she had left. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a pen and paper, trying to write down the pros and cons of Caleb's proposal. The cons column filled quickly: scandal, uncertainty, the sheer insanity of marrying someone she'd known for less than a week. The pros column was shorter but more compelling: survival, partnership, a fighting chance. At midnight, she walked across the yard to the bunkhouse. Caleb was awake, sitting on his bunk with an old book in his hands. When she knocked, he stood immediately. "Mrs. Ward, I've thought about your offer," she said. "I have conditions." "I'm listening." "This is a business arrangement. Nothing more, nothing less. You keep the bunkhouse, I keep the main house. We work together to make the ranch profitable. And when we've cleared the debts and stabilized the operation, we can discuss future arrangements." "Agreed." "I run the ranch. Final decisions on operations, finances, everything. That's mine." "Makes sense. You know the land. I'm just labor." "You're more than that now," Margaret said quietly. "Partners means I listen to your counsel, but the final word is mine." "Fair enough." She took a breath. "Then yes, I'll marry you, for survival, if nothing else." Caleb set down his book and extended his hand. When Margaret took it, his grip was firm and steady. The handshake of someone sealing a bargain, not a romance. "Then let's survive together," he said. 2 days later, they stood in Pastor Morrison's parlor with the pastor's wife as witness, and spoke the words that bound them legally, if not emotionally. Margaret wore her best dress, the same one she'd worn to Thomas's funeral. Caleb wore his only shirt, cleaned and mended. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. When Morrison pronounced them man and wife, Caleb leaned in to kiss her cheek, proper and brief. Up close, Margaret could see the scars that marked his face, the lines that trauma had carved around his eyes. He smelled like soap and leather and something else, something wild and wounded. "Congratulations," Morrison said, though his tone suggested he thought they'd both lost their minds. "May God bless your union." They signed the papers, paid the fee, and walked out into the cold afternoon as husband and wife. In the wagon heading back to the ranch, Margaret stared at the simple gold band Caleb had placed on her finger. Not Thomas's ring, which she still wore on her right hand, but a new ring for a new arrangement. "Regrets?" Caleb asked quietly. "Ask me in 6 months." That night, the night of their wedding, Margaret lay awake in her empty house listening to the wind. Across the yard, a light burned in the bunkhouse where her husband, God help them both, kept his solitary watch. They were married now, bound by law and desperation, two strangers who'd made a gamble against impossible odds. Outside, the Montana night was vast and cold and uncaring, but inside, for the first time in months, Margaret felt something besides despair. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope seemed too fragile, too optimistic for what they'd done. But it was something. A foothold. A fighting chance. She fell asleep still wearing her wedding ring and dreamed of fences that wouldn't break and debts that dissolved like snow in spring. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and salt pork frying and realized that her new husband was already awake, already working, already keeping his end of their impossible bargain. Margaret rose, dressed, and walked into her kitchen to find Caleb at the stove, his back to her as he worked. He'd found the good skillet she'd been saving, the coffee tin she'd been hoarding. Without turning around, he said, "Morning, Mrs. Ward?" Not Mrs. Hayes. He was giving her the choice of what to call herself, of how to define this strange new arrangement. "Margaret," she said, "if we're doing this, you might as well call me Margaret." He turned then, a spatula in his hand, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Not desire. It was too early for that, too complicated. But recognition, maybe. An acknowledgement that they'd crossed some line together and there was no going back. "Caleb," he said. Just Caleb. They ate breakfast in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people learning a new language together, figuring out how to exist in the same space without colliding. After breakfast, Caleb put on his coat. I'm going into town to file the marriage certificate at the county office. While I'm there, I'll visit the bank and discuss extending the loan. Might also stop by the general store. Settle your account there. Margaret started to protest, to say she should be the one handling her own business. But this was what partnership meant, sharing the burden, letting someone else carry some of the weight. Be careful, she said instead. Griswold has ears everywhere. He'll know about the marriage by sundown. Let him know. Caleb's smile was brief and hard. Maybe it'll make him think twice before cutting any more fences. He left, and Margaret stood at the window watching him ride away on the ranch's one remaining good horse. Her husband. The thought was still surreal, still impossible to fully grasp. 24 hours ago, she'd been a widow. Now she was a wife again, bound to a man she knew almost nothing about, gambling everything on a contract that could save her or destroy her. The morning passed in work. Margaret threw herself into tasks, trying not to think about what Caleb might be facing in town, what people might be saying. By noon, her hands were raw and her back was aching, but the chicken coop was clean, the wood was chopped, and she'd started on repairing the leak in the barn roof that she'd been putting off for weeks. She was up on the ladder, hammer in hand, when she heard riders approaching. Multiple riders, coming fast. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized Sheriff Coleman's sorrel mare in the lead, with two of Griswold's men flanking him. She climbed down slowly, keeping the hammer in her hand. The sheriff dismounted, his face carefully neutral. Mrs. Ward, or should I say Mrs. Hayes now? Whatever you prefer, Sheriff. What can I do for you? Just following up on a complaint. Mr. Griswold says your new husband threatened him in town this morning. Wanted to make sure there wasn't any trouble brewing. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. What kind of threat? According to Griswold, Hayes made it clear that any further incidents on this property would be met with force. Griswold felt it was necessary to establish that such threats wouldn't be tolerated. Translation. Caleb had stood up to Griswold, and now Griswold was using his family connection to the sheriff to try to intimidate them back into submission. My husband was simply establishing that we won't tolerate sabotage of our property, Margaret said carefully. Given that someone cut our fence post just 2 nights ago, I'd say that's a reasonable position. You got proof of that sabotage? The cut posts are still there if you'd like to examine them. I'll take your word for it. Coleman shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. Look, Mrs. Ward, I'm not here to cause trouble, but you need to understand the situation. Harold Griswold is an important man in this territory. He's got friends, resources, influence. Your husband, on the other hand, is a drifter nobody knows anything about. You sure you want to make an enemy of Griswold over a piece of land that's drowning in debt? This land is mine. Thomas worked himself to death for it, and I'm not giving it up without a fight. Thomas was a good man. But he's gone, and you're not him. Sometimes the smart play is knowing when to fold. One of Griswold's men, a thick-shouldered brute named Carson, leaned forward in his saddle. Maybe the lady needs more convincing, Sheriff. Maybe. That's enough, Carson. Coleman's voice was sharp. He looked back at Margaret. I'm just here as a courtesy to make sure everyone understands the law. You and your husband have every right to defend your property, but that defense better be within legal bounds. No shooting people over fence posts. Understand? Understood. And Mrs. Ward, a word of friendly advice. Your new husband's past is his own business, but be careful what kind of man you've tied yourself to. Drifters don't usually have clean histories. They rode away, leaving Margaret shaking with anger. The message was clear. Griswold was turning up the pressure, using every resource at his disposal to push them towards surrender. And now he was trying to plant seeds of doubt about Caleb. When Caleb returned an hour later, Margaret was waiting in the yard. He took one look at her face and dismounted quickly. What happened? She told him about the sheriff's visit, about Griswold's complaint, about the veiled threats and insinuations. As she spoke, she watched his face carefully, looking for signs of the temper or violence Coleman had implied. But Caleb just listened, his expression thoughtful. I shouldn't have confronted him directly, he said finally. I made this harder for you. But did you threaten him? I told him that if he wanted this property, he'd have to deal with both of us now, that any more incidents would be answered in kind. I kept it legal. No explicit threats, nothing the law could touch me for, but I made it clear we weren't backing down. The sheriff said you're a drifter with a questionable past. Caleb met her eyes directly. That's true enough. I've been drifting for years, and I'm not proud of everything I've done to survive. But I've never stolen, never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill me first, and never hurt anyone who didn't have it coming. That's all I can offer you, honesty about who I am now, even if I can't change who I was. It should have scared her. It should have made her question the bargain they'd made. But instead, Margaret found herself believing him. There was something fundamentally honest about Caleb, something that cut through the bullshit and pretense that characterized most interactions in Red Creek. The bank? She asked. Extended the loan, conditionally. We've got until end of summer to make a payment, at least $100 plus interest. After that, they'll reassess. He pulled out a receipt. I paid off the general store account and the blacksmith. Your credit's clean now. Margaret stared at the receipt, feeling something shift in her chest. He'd used his own money to clear her debts, to give them a fresh start. It was more than hired labor, more than a business arrangement. It was trust, offered without guarantees. Thank you, she said quietly. We're partners now. Your debts are my debts. He looked toward the house, then back at her. We need to talk about security. Griswold's not going to stop just because we got married. If anything, we've made ourselves bigger targets. They spent the evening developing a plan. Watch rotations, better locks on the barn and outbuildings, a signal system in case of trouble. Caleb suggested teaching her to shoot better. Thomas had shown her the basics, but she'd never been comfortable with firearms. If things get bad, I need to know you can defend yourself, he said. I can't be everywhere at once. So as the sun set over the Montana landscape, Caleb set up targets in the far field and walked Margaret through proper shooting technique. His teaching style was patient and clear, his hands steady as he helped her adjust her grip, her stance, her breathing. Don't jerk the trigger, he said quietly, standing close behind her. Squeeze smooth and steady. The shot should almost surprise you. Margaret fired, and the bottle they'd set up as a target exploded. She felt a rush of satisfaction, not at the violence, but at the competence, the sense that she was gaining tools to protect what was hers. Good, Caleb said. Again. They practiced until the light faded and her arms were shaking from the rifle's weight. When they finally stopped, Margaret realized she'd been smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in months. You're a natural, Caleb said as they walked back toward the house. Give it a few more sessions, and you'll be better than most men in town. Thomas never taught me properly. He always said he'd get around to it, but there was always something else that needed doing. Thomas sounds like he was a good man. He was. Margaret glanced sideways at her new husband. But he's gone. And I'm here. With you. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than she'd intended. In the twilight, Caleb's face was half in shadow, unreadable. Yes, ma'am. You are. That night, lying in her bed alone, Margaret thought about the kiss at their wedding, brief and proper. The brush of a stranger's lips against her cheek. She thought about Caleb in the bunkhouse, keeping watch, always vigilant. She thought about this gun on her bedside table, the new lock on her door, the strange hybrid of safety and danger they were navigating together. Outside, something moved in the darkness. Margaret was up instantly, gun in hand, heart pounding. But then she saw Caleb's silhouette by the barn, making his rounds, and she felt her racing pulse begin to slow. He saw her light come on, saw her standing at the window. He raised a hand, a simple gesture that meant, I've got this, you can sleep. And somehow, improbably, Margaret found she could. She set down the gun, crawled back into bed, and let herself sink into sleep, trusting a stranger to keep watch over her dreams. The morning after their wedding, Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and frying salt pork. The man she'd married only yesterday was already working, moving through the kitchen with silent efficiency. When their eyes met across the room, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that they'd made a choice, cast their dice, and now had to live with the consequences. Morning, Caleb said, sliding a plate across the table to her. Morning, Margaret replied, and sat down to breakfast with her new husband, wondering what impossible thing tomorrow would bring. The first full week of their marriage passed in a rhythm of work that left little room for awkwardness or second-guessing. They rose before dawn, worked through the daylight hours until their bodies ached, and fell into their separate beds too exhausted for complicated thoughts. It was survival stripped down to its essential elements: food, shelter, labor, and the stubborn refusal to surrender. On the 8th day, Caleb found Margaret in the barn struggling with a calving cow. The heifer was young, barely old enough to be carrying, and the birth was going badly. Margaret had her sleeves rolled up, sweat dripping despite the March cold, her face tight with concentration and fear. "How long has she been laboring?" Caleb asked, already moving to wash his hands in the bucket of clean water Margaret had prepared. 3 hours. The calf's positioned wrong. I can feel it, but I can't turn it. Let me try." Margaret stepped back, relief flooding through her. Thomas had been the one who handled difficult births. She'd only assisted, never led. Caleb knelt beside the heifer, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice as his hands worked with practiced confidence. Margaret watched the concentration on his face, the gentle competence of his movements, and realized this was something else he'd never mentioned: veterinary skills that went beyond basic ranch work. "There," he said after what felt like an eternity. "Got the front legs straightened. She should be able to push now." 10 minutes later, a spindly-legged calf lay in the straw, wet and shaking but alive. The heifer licked it clean with the methodical devotion of new motherhood, and Margaret felt something in her chest unclench. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. "Virginia, before the war. My father ran cattle." Caleb washed his hands again, his voice carefully neutral. "Seems like another lifetime now." Well, it was the first real piece of his past he'd offered, and Margaret found herself hungry for more. But she'd learned already that Caleb's history came in small parcels, carefully rationed, and pushing only made him retreat further into silence. "Thank you," she said instead. "I thought we were going to lose them both." "You would have figured it out. You're tougher than you give yourself credit for." The compliment caught her off guard. Thomas had praised her cooking, her housekeeping, her ability to manage the domestic side of ranch life, but he'd never called her tough, never suggested she could handle the harder work of cattle and land. Caleb said it like he was stating a simple fact, and something in Margaret responded to that recognition. They walked back to the house together as the sun climbed higher, and for the first time since the wedding, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than strange. At the door, Caleb paused. "I need to ride into town this afternoon. Pick up supplies, check on whether the marriage certificate's been properly filed. You want to come along?" Margaret's first instinct was to say no. Town meant facing the gossip, enduring the stares and whispered comments about the widow who'd married a stranger. But hiding felt like weakness, and she'd had enough of weakness. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." They took the wagon, Margaret in her best dress, and Caleb in his one clean shirt. The ride to Red Creek took 40 minutes across muddy roads that were slowly thawing into spring. Neither of them spoke much, but Margaret found herself acutely aware of Caleb's presence beside her, the way he handled the reins with casual expertise, the way his eyes constantly scanned the landscape for potential threats. Red Creek was a collection of wood frame buildings clustered around a single main street, dominated by the general store, the church, and Morrison's Feed and Supply. It wasn't much, but it was the hub of a scattered community that stretched for miles in every direction. When they pulled up in front of the general store, Margaret could see curtains twitching in windows, faces turning to watch. Inside, Mrs. Henderson behind the counter couldn't quite hide her curiosity. She was a plump woman in her 50s, the undisputed queen of local gossip, and her eyes traveled between Margaret and Caleb with unconcealed interest. "Mrs. Ward, or should I say Mrs. Hayes now? My goodness, what a surprise that was, hearing about your wedding, so sudden." "Mrs. Hayes," Margaret said firmly. "And yes, we saw no reason to wait." Of course, of course. And Mr. Hayes, welcome to Red Creek. We're always pleased to have new members of our little community." Mrs. Henderson's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Though I must say we know so little about you. Where did you say you were from?" "I didn't," Caleb said mildly, setting a list on the counter. "We need these supplies, please, and I'll settle last month's account while we're here." "Oh, that's already been taken care of, dear. You did that last week, remember?" Mrs. Henderson's smile widened. "Such a generous husband you've found yourself, Margaret. Paying off debts, providing for you. It's almost like a fairy tale, isn't it? The mysterious stranger riding in to save the day. The mockery in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Margaret felt her jaw tighten, but before she could respond, Caleb spoke. Not mysterious, just a man who married a woman he admires and respects. Now, about those supplies. His tone was pleasant, but something in it made Mrs. Henderson's smile falter. She turned to fill their order, her movements brisk and businesslike. Margaret caught Caleb's eye and saw the faintest hint of amusement there. They were loading supplies into the wagon when Samuel Fletcher approached. He was exactly as Margaret remembered, thick-necked, tobacco-stained, radiating the confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. Margaret, heard about your hasty marriage. Shame, really. I was planning to make you a proper offer myself. Mr. Fletcher, Margaret said coolly, this is my husband, Caleb Hayes. Fletcher looked Caleb up and down with the assessing gaze of a livestock buyer. Hayes, heard you're new to these parts. Don't suppose you know much about ranching in Montana country. Enough to keep things running, Caleb said evenly. That's so. Well, if you find yourself in over your head, I'd be happy to buy the place off you. Save you the embarrassment of foreclosure. I'm prepared to offer— The ranch isn't for sale, Margaret interrupted. Not to you, not to Griswold, not to anyone. Fletcher's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Margaret. This territory isn't kind to stubborn women or ignorant drifters. Mark my words, by summer you'll be begging someone to take that property off your hands. He walked away, leaving a trail of tobacco juice and malice. Margaret felt her hand shaking as she climbed into the wagon. Caleb didn't speak until they were well outside town, the building shrinking behind them. How many of them are there? He asked quietly. What? Men like that. Men who think your property is theirs for the taking, who look at you like you're livestock they can purchase. Margaret was silent for a moment, counting in her head. Fletcher, Griswold for certain, probably 3 or 4 others who'd jump at the chance if the price was right. Red Creek's not a big town, but it's big enough for vultures. Then we'll just have to make sure they have nothing to feed on. The determination in his voice made something in Margaret's chest loosen. For months she'd felt like prey, hunted, vulnerable, constantly on the defensive. But sitting beside Caleb on the wagon seat, watching his capable hands guide the horses, she felt something shift. Maybe she wasn't prey anymore. Maybe she'd found a partner who'd fight beside her instead of trying to manage or save her. They were halfway home when they saw the smoke, black and thick, rising from the direction of their property. Caleb saw it first, his body going rigid. Without a word, he snapped the reins and the horses surged forward, the wagon rattling dangerously over the rough road. Margaret gripped the seat, her heart hammering, already knowing what they'd find. The barn wasn't fully ablaze yet, but flames were crawling up the south wall where someone had piled dry brush and doused it with kerosene. Caleb had the wagon stopped before it fully halted, jumping down and running for the water barrels. Margaret was right behind him, grabbing buckets, organizing a chain between the well and the fire. They fought it for an hour, their faces blackened with smoke, their clothes soaked and stinking. The cattle had broken through a fence in their panic, scattering into the fields. By the time they got the fire under control, the barn's south wall was charred and unstable, and Margaret's hands were blistered from the bucket handles. Caleb inspected the damage, his face grim. Started on the outside. Deliberate, professional enough to make it look like it could have been an accident, but we both know better. Griswold, Margaret said, her voice hoarse from smoke. Probably. Or Fletcher. Or any of the others who want you desperate enough to sell. He turned to look at her, and Margaret saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Pure, controlled rage. This can't stand. What are you going to do? What I should have done the first time. Make it clear that there are consequences for touching what's ours. The possessive pronoun, ours, sent a strange thrill through Margaret's exhausted body, but fear followed close behind. Caleb, if you do something stupid, if you give them a reason to arrest you, I'm not going to do anything illegal, but I'm going to make sure whoever did this understands they picked the wrong target. He touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of reassurance. Trust me. He left at dusk, taking the good horse and his rifle. Margaret wanted to stop him, to argue, to demand he tell her his plan, but some instinct told her that Caleb needed to do this, not just for the ranch, but for himself. He'd spent years running from fights, drifting away from trouble. Now he was choosing to stand and face it. She spent the evening tending to the spooked cattle, repairing the fence they'd broken, and trying not to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. The blisters on her hands made every task agony, but she welcomed the pain. It gave her something to focus on besides the fear. Caleb returned 3 hours later, his expression unreadable. He stabled the horse and came to find Margaret in the kitchen, where she was wrapping her burned hands in clean cloth. "Let me see those," he said, taking her hands gently in his. His fingers were careful as he examined the blisters. "You should have stopped working hours ago. Cattle needed tending. Fence needed fixing." Margaret watched his face as he worked, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. "What did you do?" "Paid a visit to Griswold's ranch, had a conversation with his foreman. And I made it clear that the next incident would be met with more than conversation. I didn't threaten violence. I didn't have to. Sometimes just showing a man you're not afraid of him is enough." "Did you find proof it was them?" "I found a half-empty kerosene can behind their equipment shed, same brand that was used to start our fire. Not proof that would hold up in court, but proof enough for me." He finished wrapping her hands, his touch lingering for just a moment. "Griswold wasn't there. He's in Helena on business, but his men got the message." Margaret should have been angry at him for taking such a risk, for confronting Griswold's people without backup or a clear plan, but instead she felt a fierce gratitude. No one had fought for her like this since Thomas died. No one had treated her battles as their own. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. This might just make things worse before they get better." He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated. Fence posts were pulled up in the night. Water troughs were contaminated. One morning, they found a dead coyote hanging from their gate, a clear warning. But each incident was met with Caleb's steady, implacable response. He documented everything, reported to the sheriff despite knowing Coleman wouldn't help, and made sure everyone in Red Creek knew exactly what was happening. The town began to split into factions. Some people, mostly those with their own grudges against Griswold, started showing quiet support. Jacob Miller, who ran the feed store, extended their credit without being asked. Maria Sanchez, whose husband worked at the lumber mill, stopped by with fresh bread and information about when Griswold's men were drinking in town, making themselves vulnerable to observation. Others sided firmly with Griswold, seeing the established power structure as the safer bet. They crossed the street when they saw Margaret coming, refused to do business with Caleb, and spread increasingly vicious rumors about the hasty marriage and what it implied about Margaret's character. Through it all, Margaret and Caleb worked. They rebuilt the barn wall, stronger than before. They moved the cattle to a more protected pasture and set up a proper watch rotation. They planted the spring garden, repaired every broken thing on the property, and slowly, painfully, began to turn the ranch from a dying liability into something that might actually survive. At night, they sat by the fire and talked, real conversations that went beyond work assignments and practical planning. Margaret learned that Caleb had grown up in the Shenandoah Valley, that he'd lost his entire family to the war, that he'd spent years trying to drink away memories before deciding that survival required staying sober and keeping moving. "I was at Chancellorsville," he said one evening, staring into the flames. "Saw things no one should see, did things I can't take back. After the surrender, I just walked away. Kept walking for 10 years. "What made you stop?" "Here, I mean, at my fence." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I was tired. Tired of running, tired of being nobody, tired of waking up every morning with nothing to live for except making it to nightfall. Your fence needed fixing, and for the first time in years I thought maybe I could fix something that mattered." Margaret understood that feeling better than he probably realized. She told him about Philadelphia, about growing up poor and desperate, about meeting Thomas and believing she'd finally found security. "Then he died, and I realized security was just an illusion. The only thing I could count on was myself. And now? Now I'm learning I can count on you too. Maybe." The maybe hung between them, honest and uncertain. They'd been married for 3 weeks, but they were still strangers in so many ways, still learning each other's rhythms, still testing the boundaries of their arrangement. One morning in early April, Margaret woke to find spring had finally arrived in earnest. The snow was gone, but the grass was greening, and the air carried the scent of growing things instead of ice and decay. She stood on the porch, breathing it in, feeling something like hope for the first time since Thomas's death. Caleb emerged from the barn leading a horse, not their usual workhorse, but a sleek bay mare Margaret had never seen before. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "Bought her from Jacob Miller. Got a good price, and we needed a second riding horse." He paused, then added, "Thought maybe you'd like to ride out and check the far pasture with me today. See how the land looks now that winter's broken." It wasn't necessary work. The far pasture could wait another day. But Margaret recognized the offer for what it was, a chance to breathe, to see their land as something more than an endless series of problems to solve. "Give me 10 minutes to change," she said. They rode out across greening fields, following the creek that marked the northern boundary of their property. The cattle were scattered across the landscape, finally relaxed after the hard winter and the recent harassment. Birds called from the cottonwoods, and the mountains stood sharp and clear against an impossibly blue sky. Margaret had forgotten how beautiful the land could be. During the worst of winter, during the darkest days of her widowhood, she'd stopped seeing the beauty, seeing only the burden, the responsibility, the crushing weight of keeping it all from falling apart. Now, riding beside Caleb with the spring sun warm on her face, she remembered why Thomas had chosen this place, why they dreamed of building something here. "It's a good piece of land," Caleb said, as if reading her thoughts. "With proper management, it could support twice the cattle we have now, maybe more. Thomas always said we'd expand the herd once we got established. But there was always something else that needed the money first. We'll get there. Not this year, maybe not next year, but we'll get there." The casual confidence in his voice made Margaret smile. "You sound pretty certain for a man who married into debt and near ruin." "I married into possibility. The debt's just temporary." He turned in his saddle to look at her directly. "You're a fighter, Margaret. You just needed someone to fight alongside you instead of someone trying to fight for you or manage you into submission." It was the most personal thing he'd said since their wedding, and it hit her with unexpected force. Because he was right. Thomas had loved her, but he'd also tried to shield her, to handle the difficult things himself, to keep her in the domestic sphere where women were supposed to be safe and contained. Caleb treated her like an equal partner, sometimes frustratingly so, when he expected her to handle things she'd never been taught to handle. But there was respect in that expectation. Trust. They stopped by the creek to let the horses drink. Margaret dismounted, her legs stiff from riding. She walked to the water's edge and knelt, trailing her fingers in the current. The water was snow-melt cold and crystalline. "I was pregnant once," she heard herself say. The words came from nowhere, unexpected even to her. 2 years ago. Lost the baby at 4 months. Thomas and we never talked about it after, just kept working, kept planning, kept pretending it hadn't happened. Caleb knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I'm sorry." "I think that's when I learned that security was an illusion. You can plan and work and do everything right and still lose everything in a moment." She looked at him, at his scarred face and steady eyes. "Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, though." "No," he agreed. "Doesn't mean that at all." His hand found hers, his calloused fingers interlacing with her bandaged ones. It was the first time they'd touched with anything approaching intimacy since their wedding, and Margaret felt her breath catch. Not with fear or reluctance, but with something else. Recognition, maybe. Of a connection that was growing despite their efforts to keep things purely practical. She pulled her hand away gently, standing. "We should check the fence line before we head back." If Caleb was disappointed, he didn't show it. They mounted again and continued their ride. The moment passed, but not forgotten. By the time they returned to the ranch, the sun was setting and Margaret's legs were aching, but there was a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the spring weather. That night, she lay in bed thinking about Caleb's hand in hers, about the way he'd listened to her story without trying to fix it or diminish it, about the slow accumulation of small moments that were transforming their arrangement into something that felt dangerously close to real. The next morning brought Sheriff Coleman and 2 deputies to their door. Margaret's stomach dropped at the sight of them, but Caleb was calm as he stepped onto the porch. Sheriff, what can we do for you? Need to talk to you about an incident at the Griswold Ranch 2 nights ago. Someone cut the ropes on his corral, let all his horses scatter. Took them most of the night to round them up. And you think I had something to do with that? Caleb's voice was mild, but Margaret could hear the steel beneath it. Griswold seems to think so. Says you threatened retaliation after that fire at your barn. I told his foreman there would be consequences if the harassment continued. I didn't threaten to commit crimes. Caleb leaned against the porch rail, relaxed and confident. Where was I 2 nights ago? Here, all night. My wife can confirm that. Coleman looked at Margaret. That true, Mrs. Hayes? Margaret met his eyes steadily. Absolutely. Caleb was here from dusk until dawn. We've been taking shifts watching the property. You can understand why, given the recent incidents. Convenient that you're his alibi. Convenient that I'm his wife and was actually here, Margaret shot back. Unless you think I'm lying, in which case I'd like to know what evidence you have besides Harold Griswold's suspicions. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. He'd known Margaret since she'd arrived in Red Creek as Thomas's bride, and he'd always treated her with respect even if he did favor Griswold's interests. Calling her a liar was a step too far, even for him. No evidence, he admitted, just following up on a complaint. But Hayes, let me give you some advice. This territory's got rules, and men who come in thinking they can ignore those rules tend to find themselves in trouble. Real trouble. I appreciate the advice, Sheriff, Caleb said evenly, and I'll keep it in mind. Now, if you don't mind, we've got work to do. After they left, Margaret turned to Caleb. Did you do it? Let Griswold's horses loose? What do you think? I think you were here all night, like I said, but I also think you might have paid someone else to deliver that message. Caleb's smile was brief and dangerous. Best not to ask questions you don't want answers to. Margaret should have been angry, should have lectured him about the risks of retaliation. But instead she felt a fierce satisfaction. Griswold had burned their barn, killed their livestock, tried to terrorize them into submission. Turnabout wasn't just fair play, it was necessary. Just be careful, she said. We can't win if you're in jail. I'm always careful. The harassment stopped after that. Not permanently. Margaret was sure Griswold was simply regrouping, planning something more elaborate. But for a few weeks, they had peace. They used the time to push the ranch toward profitability. Caleb proved to have the talent for livestock management, improving the cattle's condition and health with changes to their feeding and grazing patterns. Margaret expanded the garden, worked on improving the chicken operation, and started exploring whether they could add sheep to their operation for additional income. In late April, Jacob Miller stopped by with unexpected news. Heard the railroad's looking to buy beef for their crews laying track west of Helena. Might be a good opportunity if you can get cattle there by mid-May. It was exactly the kind of opportunity they needed. A chance to sell at premium prices instead of taking whatever the local market offered. But getting cattle to Helena meant a 3-day drive through rough country, and they couldn't both go without leaving the ranch vulnerable. I'll take them, Caleb said after Miller left. You stay here and keep things running. Margaret wanted to argue, to insist they find another way. But the arithmetic was brutal. They needed this sale. Without it, they wouldn't make the summer payment to the bank. How many can you drive alone? 10 head, maybe 12 if they're docile. Enough to make the trip worth it. They spent 2 days preparing, selecting the best cattle, making sure Caleb had supplies for the journey. The night before he was supposed to leave, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. She got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and walked out into the yard. Caleb was sitting on the porch, his rifle across his knees. Couldn't sleep either. Too much thinking. She sat beside him, careful to leave space between them. What if something happens while you're gone? What if Griswold makes his move? Then you defend the place until I get back. You're tougher than you think, Margaret. Tougher than anyone gives you credit for. I'm scared, she admitted. Of failing. Of losing this place after everything we've put into it. Of... She stopped, unable to finish the thought. Of what? Of losing you. The words came out before she could stop them. Which is stupid, because this is supposed to be a business arrangement, but somewhere along the way you became necessary, and I don't know how to feel about that. Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. "I know what you mean. I came here expecting to drift through, do some work, move on. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a job. You stopped being just an employer. What are we doing, Caleb? Surviving, building something, figuring it out as we go." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight, his scarred face was beautiful in its honesty. "I don't know what this becomes, but I know I'm not running anymore. Whatever we're building here, together, I'm in it for the long haul." Margaret felt something in her chest crack open. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. This time, neither of them pulled away. They sat together in the darkness, holding on, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret felt something besides fear about the future. The next morning, Caleb left before dawn with 12 head of cattle and a promise to return within a week. Margaret stood in the yard watching him ride away, feeling the absence already. But she didn't let herself dwell on it. There was work to do, a ranch to protect, and a future to build. She threw herself into tasks, working from sunrise to well past dark. She reinforced the fences, reorganized the barn, and started preliminary work on expanding the chicken coop. At night, she walked the property with Thomas's rifle, keeping watch, half expecting trouble. On the third day, trouble arrived. She was in the garden when she heard horses. 3 riders, coming fast from the direction of town. Margaret's hand moved to the pistol she'd started wearing on her hip, but she didn't draw it. Not yet. Harold Griswold dismounted in her yard like he owned it. The 2 men with him, Carson and another bruiser named Dutch, flanked him with their hands near their guns. "Mrs. Hayes, where's your husband?" "Business in Helena." Margaret kept her voice steady, her hand near her weapon. "What can I do for you?" "You can stop playing games. I know Hayes was behind what happened to my horses. I know he's been spreading lies about me in town, and I know he's not here now to protect you." "I don't need protection, Mr. Griswold." "Everyone needs protection, Mrs. Hayes, especially women who make poor decisions." He stepped closer, and Margaret caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. "Your husband is a nobody, a drifter with a violent past and no future. He's using you to get his hands on this property, and once he's wrung every penny out of it, he'll disappear like morning fog." "You don't know anything about my husband." "I know men, and I know when someone's running a confidence game." Griswold's smile was ugly. "But here's the thing. I'm a reasonable man. I'm prepared to make you one final offer, $500 for the property, with the condition that the sale goes through before your husband gets back. You sign today, and you never have to see him again." Margaret laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You really think I'm that stupid, that desperate? I think you're a woman alone on a failing ranch with a husband who might not even come back from Helena. I think you're one bad day away from losing everything, and I think $500 is more money than you're likely to see otherwise. Get off my property. Or what? You'll shoot me?" Griswold gestured to his men. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Even if you got me, Carson and Dutch would make sure you didn't live to brag about it. Is that really how you want this to end?" Margaret's hand tightened on her pistol grip. He was right. She was outnumbered and outgunned. But if she backed down now, if she showed weakness, it would never end. Griswold would keep pushing until he got what he wanted. "I'm giving you one chance to leave peacefully," she said, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. "After that, we see what happens." For a moment, she thought Griswold might actually push it. His hand moved toward his own gun, and Carson shifted his weight like he was preparing to draw. The air crackled with potential violence. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Maria Sanchez stood at the edge of the yard, a shotgun in her hands and fire in her eyes. Behind her, Margaret could see Jacob Miller and 2 of his sons, all armed. And behind them, Pastor Morrison's buggy was pulling up, the pastor himself climbing down with surprising speed for an old man. "This is a private matter," Griswold snarled. "This is a community matter," Morrison said firmly, "and the community stands with Mrs. Hayes. Now I suggest you leave before this situation escalates beyond repair." Griswold looked around at the assembled group, his face mottled with rage. But he was smart enough to recognize when he was beaten. "This isn't over," he said to Margaret. "Yes, it is," she replied. "We're done being intimidated. We're done being threatened. You want this property? You'll have to take it legally. And good luck with that now that half the town knows what you've been up to." He mounted his horse, jerking the reins so hard the animal shied. His men followed, and they rode out in a cloud of dust and fury. When they were gone, Margaret's legs nearly gave out. Maria caught her arm, steadying her. "You all right, mija?" "I will be. Thank you, all of you. How did you know to come?" "Miller's boy saw them heading this direction," Maria said. "We figured it couldn't be good, with Caleb gone and you here alone. So we gathered some folks who were tired of watching Griswold run roughshod over decent people." Pastor Morrison approached, his expression apologetic. "I owe you an apology, Margaret. I was wrong to suggest you should sell to Griswold or marry Samuel Fletcher. You've shown more courage and integrity than most men I know. Your husband is a fortunate man." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, not of fear or weakness, but of overwhelming gratitude. She'd spent so long feeling alone, feeling like she was fighting an impossible battle with no support. But the community had been there all along, waiting for someone to take a stand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you all so much." They stayed for an hour, helping with chores and making sure she was truly all right. When they finally left, Margaret walked through the ranch, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't just her property anymore, wasn't just the legacy of her marriage to Thomas or her arrangement with Caleb. It was something bigger, a symbol of resistance against bullies and land grabbers, a testament to what people could accomplish when they refused to surrender. Caleb returned 5 days later, driving the empty wagon and carrying a money pouch that made Margaret's eyes widen. "Sold all 12 head at premium prices. Railroad crews are hungry for beef, and they're not particular about negotiating. We've got enough here to make the summer payment and still have operating capital left over." Margaret launched herself at him, throwing her arms around his neck in a completely spontaneous gesture that surprised them both. He caught her, stumbling back a step, his arms coming up to hold her steady. "I missed you," she said into his shoulder. "And while you were gone, Griswold tried to intimidate me into selling, but the community came together and ran him off. And I think we're finally winning, Caleb. I think we're actually going to make it." She was babbling, the words tumbling out in a rush of relief and joy, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. When she finally pulled back to look at his face, she saw wonder there, and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "Margaret," he said quietly, "can I kiss you? A real kiss. Not the polite thing at our wedding." She should have said no, should have maintained the boundaries of their arrangement, but she was tired of boundaries, tired of keeping herself locked away from feeling. She nodded, and Caleb's mouth found hers, gentle at first, then deepening as she responded. It wasn't desperation or convenience, it was recognition of what they'd built together, of what they were becoming. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Margaret rested her forehead against his. "We're really doing this, aren't we? Not just the ranch, but this. If you want to." "I want to," she whispered. "God help me. I want to." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Caleb didn't sleep in the bunkhouse. They lay together in the big bed Thomas had built, not yet ready for full intimacy, but needing the closeness, the warmth, the simple comfort of not being alone. Margaret curled against Caleb's side, listening to his heartbeat, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but happiness. The spring stretched out before them, full of work and possibility. The ranch was stabilizing, the community was rallying around them, and somewhere along the way their practical arrangement had transformed into something real. It wasn't the safe, gentle love she'd had with Thomas. It was fiercer, forged in shared struggle and mutual respect. As Margaret drifted toward sleep, she felt Caleb's hand find hers under the blankets, his fingers interlacing with hers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, they had this: each other, the ranch they were saving together, and the fragile, growing thing between them that was starting to feel like love. The morning came soft and golden, sunlight filtering through the curtains Margaret had sewn 2 summers ago, when the future still seemed certain. She woke to find Caleb already awake beside her, his eyes tracing the patterns of light on the ceiling. When he noticed she was watching him, something vulnerable crossed his face before he schooled it back to the steady calm she'd come to recognize. "I've been thinking about the north pasture," he said, as if they hadn't crossed some invisible threshold the night before, as if everything hadn't changed between them. If we could clear that rocky section, we'd have room for at least 15 more head come next spring. Everything himself. We're different. We have help now. The community proved that yesterday. He was right. Something had shifted in Red Creek when Maria and Jacob and even Pastor Morrison had stood with them against Griswold. The invisible wall of isolation that had surrounded Margaret since Thomas's death had finally cracked. She wasn't alone anymore, not just because of Caleb, but because the town had chosen sides, and some of them had chosen hers. They rose and dressed with the awkwardness of people still learning how to exist in each other's space. Caleb turned his back while Margaret changed, a gesture of respect that made her chest ache. When they finally emerged into the kitchen, the morning routine settled around them like a familiar coat. Coffee, breakfast, the quiet planning of the day's work. But underneath it all hummed something new, electric and unspoken. The day passed in hard labor. Caleb worked on repairing the chicken coop while Margaret tackled the endless task of mending clothes and harnesses that had been neglected during the winter months. Around noon, Jacob Miller's eldest son, Timothy, rode up with a message. Pa says to tell you there's a meeting at the church tonight. Folks want to talk about forming a proper ranchers association. Make it harder for men like Griswold to push individuals around. He's hoping you and Mr. Hayes will come. Margaret exchanged glances with Caleb. An association meant formal alliances, shared resources, collective bargaining power. It also meant public declarations of loyalty that could make them permanent targets of Griswold's wrath. Tell your father we'll be there, Caleb said. That evening, they rode into town in their Sunday best, or what passed for it. Margaret wore the blue dress she'd been married in, and Caleb had borrowed a proper jacket from somewhere, though it pulled tight across his shoulders. The church was packed when they arrived, every pew filled with ranchers and farmers from miles around. Margaret recognized most of the faces: the Millers, the Sanchez family, old William Burke, who ran sheep on the eastern range, even some of the smaller homesteaders who usually kept to themselves. Harold Griswold was conspicuously absent, but Samuel Fletcher sat in the back with a handful of other men who clearly weren't there to support cooperation. Pastor Morrison called the meeting to order, his voice carrying surprising authority. We're here tonight because we've all felt the pressure, not just from Griswold, though he's the most aggressive, but from a system that favors the wealthy and powerful over the small operator. Individually, we're vulnerable. Together, we might have a chance. Jacob Miller stood up, his weathered face set with determination. I propose we form the Red Creek Cattlemen's Association, pool our resources for things like bulk supply purchases, share labor during harvest and roundup, establish collective marketing to get better prices, and most importantly, we agree to defend each other's property rights against intimidation and illegal harassment. Sounds like socialism, Fletcher called out from the back. Next you'll be wanting us to share the profits too. It's called cooperation, Samuel, and it's how civilized people survive in hard country, Maria Sanchez shot back. My grandfather worked a communal land grant in Mexico. The system worked for 3 generations until the American Army showed up and decided individual property rights were more important than community survival. The meeting descended into argument, heated but mostly civil. Margaret watched the dynamics, seeing how the community was genuinely split. Those who'd been victims of Griswold's expansion tactics wanted unity and protection. Those who hoped to benefit from his patronage or feared his retaliation argued for individual liberty and against interference in free enterprise. Caleb stood up, and the room gradually quieted. He hadn't spoken yet, and people were curious about the stranger who'd married into their community. I'm new here, he said simply, so maybe I don't have the right to speak. But I've seen what happens when powerful men are allowed to run roughshod over everyone else. I saw it in Virginia during the war, big plantation owners with their private militias, making sure they kept control even when the government was too busy fighting to stop them. I saw it in the territories I drifted through after, cattle barons fencing off public land, water bosses controlling who could and couldn't survive. He paused, his eyes moving across the room. The only thing that ever stopped them was people standing together. Not violence, not lawlessness, just ordinary people refusing to be bullied alone. Pretty speech, Fletcher said. But you're still just a drifter who married desperate. What makes you think you have any stake in how we run things here? Margaret stood before Caleb could respond. He has a stake because he's my husband and a property owner in this community. Same as you, Samuel, and his opinion carries weight because he's right. We've all felt Griswold's pressure. Some of you have sold out because you had no choice. Others have bent the knee and do his bidding because it seems safer. But there's another option, standing together. And when Griswold retaliates, Fletcher pressed, when he uses his connections to the territorial government, his money, his hired guns, what then? Then we document everything and make it public, Caleb said. We keep records, we report to federal marshals if necessary. We make it more expensive for him to break us than to leave us alone. Bullies thrive in darkness and isolation. We bring light and unity. The vote was closer than Margaret hoped, but decisive enough to matter. 23 families joined the association that night. 12, led by Fletcher, abstained or voted against. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a start. Walking out of the church, Margaret felt Caleb's hand find hers in the darkness. Fletcher and his supporters watched them leave with hostile eyes, but others, Maria, Jacob, old William Burke, nodded with something like respect. You made an enemy of Fletcher tonight, Margaret said as they climbed into the wagon. I made an enemy of Fletcher the day I married you. At least now he knows where I stand. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing what the association might mean. As they approached the ranch, Caleb suddenly pulled the wagon to a stop, his body going tense. What is it? Smoke. Not much, but enough. He snapped the reins and the horses surged forward. The barn was untouched this time, but the chicken coop, the one Caleb had just finished repairing, was ablaze. The fire was small and contained, obviously meant more as a message than serious destruction, but it was enough. Someone had been here while they were at the meeting. Someone had waited for them to leave and then struck. They fought the fire together, moving with practiced efficiency. By the time they had it under control, the coop was damaged but salvageable, and Margaret was shaking with rage rather than fear. Fletcher, she said, or one of his people, they knew we'd be at the meeting. Caleb knelt by the remains of the fire, examining the burn patterns. Kerosene again. Same signature as before. Whoever's doing this wants us to know it's deliberate. I'm going to kill him. Margaret's voice was flat, and she meant it. No, you're not. Caleb stood, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Because that's what they want. They want us to do something stupid, something illegal they can use against us. We're not giving them that satisfaction. Then what do? We rebuild. Again. And we make sure everyone knows what happened, so the pattern is clear. And we keep building the association because that's what really scares them. Not individual resistance, but organized solidarity. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the injustice of it all. But Caleb was right, and she knew it. So she swallowed her fury and channeled it into work instead. They spent the next 2 days rebuilding the chicken coop, and this time when they finished, Caleb added an innovation, a bell system rigged to alert them if anyone approached the outbuildings at night. Word of the fire spread through the association network. The next evening, William Burke arrived with lumber. 2 days later, Maria brought chickens to replace the ones that had died in the fire. Jacob Miller showed up with his sons and spent a full day helping reinforce all their outbuildings against future attacks. This is what the association means, Jacob said as they worked. Attack one of us, you attack all of us. Griswold seemed to recognize he'd overplayed his hand. The harassment stopped, or at least became more subtle. But Margaret knew it wasn't over. Men like Griswold didn't give up just because their first strategies failed. They adapted, found new pressure points, waited for better opportunities. May rolled into June, and the ranch finally began to feel like it might actually survive. The cattle were healthy, the garden was producing, and the association had negotiated a bulk supply purchase that saved everyone money. More importantly, Margaret and Caleb had found a rhythm together, not just in work, but in life. He'd moved his few possessions from the bunkhouse to the main house, and while they still maintained some boundaries, the walls between them were coming down brick by careful brick. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Margaret found herself talking about Thomas, really talking about him for the first time since his death. I loved him, she said quietly, but I'm not sure he ever really saw me. I was his wife, his helpmate, the woman who made his house a home. But my own thoughts, My own capabilities? I don't think he understood I had those. Not really. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Thomas sounds like most men of his generation. Good, decent, but limited in how they see women. You're not much older than Thomas was. No, but I've seen things that changed how I see the world. War has a way of stripping away illusions. I watched women in Virginia hold farms together while their men were gone. Watched them fight off raiders, manage complex business operations, make decisions that kept entire communities alive. Hard to maintain illusions about female capability after that. Margaret turned to look at him. Is that why you treat me like an equal? Because of the war? I treat you like an equal because you are one. The war just taught me to recognize what should have been obvious. He reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Margaret. You just didn't know it until circumstances forced you to discover it. I'm not strong. I'm just stubborn. Same thing in the long run. She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. They'd been married almost 3 months now, and somewhere along the way the arrangement had become real. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it was the night he'd come back from Helena and she'd thrown herself into his arms. Or maybe it was one of the hundreds of small moments between the accumulation of shared work and shared danger and shared survival. Caleb, she said softly, what happens when the danger passes? When the ranch is stable and Griswold gives up and we're just living? What do you mean? I mean, we came together out of necessity. What if necessity is the only thing holding us together? What if... He kissed her, cutting off the spiral of doubt. When he pulled back, his eyes were fierce. Margaret Ward Hayes, I didn't fall in love with you because of necessity. I fell in love with you in spite of it. Necessity brought me to your door, but what I feel for you now has nothing to do with survival and everything to do with choice. I choose you. Every day I choose you. The words hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't want to. I tried not to, but I do. They made love that night with the windows open to the summer breeze, taking their time, learning each other's bodies with the same careful attention they'd learned each other's work rhythms and communication styles. It was nothing like Margaret's experiences with Thomas. Tender but perfunctory encounters focused on duty and potential procreation. This was mutual exploration, pleasure given and received in equal measure, vulnerability and trust woven together. Afterward, lying tangled in sheets damp with sweat and summer heat, Margaret felt something in her chest expand. This was what she'd been missing with Thomas, she realized, not passion necessarily, though that was part of it, but true partnership. The sense that she was fully seen and fully valued, that her pleasure and her perspective mattered as much as his. I could get used to this, Caleb murmured against her hair. You better. You're stuck with me now. Best trap I ever walked into. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time in months, Margaret's dreams were peaceful. The peace lasted exactly 3 weeks. On a scorching July afternoon, Sheriff Coleman arrived with papers. Margaret's stomach dropped at the sight of his grim expression. What now? She asked. Lawsuit. Griswold suing you and Hayes for slander and property damage. Claims you've been spreading lies about him around town and that Hayes was responsible for releasing his horses back in April. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. That's insane. We've told the truth about his harassment, and Caleb was here the night those horses were released. I gave you his alibi myself. Wife's alibi doesn't count for much in court, Coleman said, not unkindly. Look, I think this is bullshit too, but Griswold's got a lawyer from Helena, and he's filed in territorial court. You're going to have to respond or face default judgment. We don't have money for a lawyer, Margaret said, her mind racing. That's the point, isn't it? He knows a lawsuit will bankrupt us, even if we win. Probably. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. I'm just the messenger. After Coleman left, Margaret and Caleb sat at the kitchen table staring at the legal papers. The language was dense and intimidating, full of whereas and heretofore and other linguistic barriers designed to keep ordinary people from understanding their own legal jeopardy. We could represent ourselves, Caleb said slowly. Lots of people do in territorial court. Against a Helena lawyer, we'd be slaughtered. Maybe. Or maybe we use the truth. We document every incident of harassment, get testimony from association members, make this about his pattern of behavior rather than our alleged slander. Margaret wanted to believe it could work, but the fear was like ice in her veins. This was Griswold's masterstroke, using the legal system itself as a weapon, forcing them to spend time and money they didn't have defending against charges that were fundamentally false but difficult to disprove. That evening, she called an emergency meeting of the association. 20 families crammed into the miller's barn, and Margaret laid out the situation. To her surprise, the response was immediate and practical. "My brother's a clerk at the territorial courthouse," Maria said. "He can help us understand the legal process, what forms need filing." "I worked as a legal secretary in Denver before coming west," offered Emma Chen, a quiet woman whose husband ran a small horse operation. "I can help draft responses and prepare documents." "We take up a collection," Jacob Miller said firmly. "Everyone contributes what they can to a legal defense fund. This isn't just about the Hayes place anymore. It's about whether Griswold can use the courts to terrorize anyone who stands up to him." By the end of the meeting, they had the skeleton of a defense strategy and $43 in pledged contributions. It wasn't enough for a proper lawyer, but it was a start. More importantly, it was proof that the association was real, that solidarity meant something concrete. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret and Caleb worked with Emma Chen to prepare their defense. They documented every incident of harassment, collected written testimony from neighbors who'd witnessed Griswold's threats, and built a timeline that showed a clear pattern of intimidation. Emma proved to be invaluable. Her legal knowledge combined with Margaret's detailed record-keeping, producing a response that was surprisingly professional. "This is actually good," Emma said, reviewing their final draft. "You're not just denying his charges, you're building a counter-narrative that puts him on trial. If the judge is fair, this could work." The hearing was set for early August in Helena. The night before they were supposed to leave, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept imagining everything that could go wrong: a hostile judge, evidence they'd forgotten, legal technicalities they didn't understand. Caleb found her on the porch at midnight, wrapped in a blanket against the cool mountain air. "Can't stop thinking about it either," he said, sitting beside her. "What if we lose? The judgment could take everything. Then we start over, together." He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Margaret, I've lost everything before. My family, my home, my entire world. I survived. We'll survive this too, whatever happens. I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to thrive. I want to build something that lasts. We will. This is just another obstacle we've faced worse." They left for Helena before dawn, taking the stage because the 3-day wagon journey would eat up too much time. The trip was expensive and uncomfortable, but it got them to the territorial capital with a day to spare. They found a cheap boarding house and spent the evening reviewing their case one more time, making sure they had all their documentation organized. The courthouse was an imposing stone building that made Margaret feel small and insignificant. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and legal jargon, lawyers in expensive suits sweeping past with armloads of papers. Griswold was there with his attorney, a sharp-faced man named Blackwood, who looked at Margaret and Caleb like they were dirt under his expensive shoes. The judge was a weathered man in his 60s named Thornton. Margaret couldn't read his expression as he called the case to order, couldn't tell if he was sympathetic or hostile or simply indifferent. Blackwood presented Griswold's case first, painting Margaret and Caleb as malicious troublemakers who'd launched a campaign of slander against his client. He produced witnesses, Fletcher and 2 of Griswold's ranch hands, who testified that they'd heard the Hayes couple making unfounded accusations around town. He characterized Caleb as a dangerous drifter with a violent past, suggesting without quite stating that he'd been responsible for various acts of vandalism on Griswold's property. It was a masterful performance, equal parts truth and distortion, and Margaret felt her hope crumbling as it went on. Then it was their turn. Caleb stood and faced the judge directly. "Your Honor, we're not lawyers and we don't have the fancy words Mr. Blackwood uses, but we do have the truth and we have evidence." He laid out their case methodically. Every incident of harassment documented with dates and details, testimony from association members, even photographs Emma Chen had helped them take of the cut fence posts and burned buildings. He presented the pattern clearly, showing how Griswold's harassment had escalated as they'd resisted his attempts to purchase their property. "Mr. Griswold claims we've slandered him," Caleb said. "But slander is a lie told with malicious intent. Everything we've said about him is true, and we can prove it. He's systematically tried to drive us off our land using intimidation, sabotage, and now legal harassment. The real question isn't whether we've damaged his reputation. It's whether this court will allow a powerful man to use the legal system to silence people telling the truth about his behavior." Margaret followed, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger as she spoke. She talked about losing Thomas, about the desperation that had led her to marry a stranger, about the systematic campaign of terror they'd endured. She looked directly at Judge Thornton as she spoke, willing him to see them as human beings rather than just names on a docket. "We're not perfect," she said. "We've made mistakes. But we've never lied about Mr. Griswold, and we've never damaged his property. All we've done is refuse to be bullied into selling land that's rightfully ours. If that's grounds for a lawsuit, then justice means nothing." Blackwood's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to discredit their evidence, suggested their witnesses were biased, implied that Margaret had seduced Caleb into marriage specifically to avoid Griswold's legitimate purchase offers. But every time he pushed, Caleb or Margaret pushed back with documented facts, with dates and details that couldn't be easily dismissed. The hearing lasted 6 hours. By the end, Margaret was exhausted and dizzy, running on adrenaline and desperation. Judge Thornton called a recess to review the evidence, and they stumbled out into the August heat, unsure whether they'd done enough. "You were amazing in there," Caleb said, pulling her into his arms right there on the courthouse steps, not caring who saw. "Absolutely amazing. We still might lose. Maybe. But we told the truth. That counts for something." They waited 3 agonizing days for the decision. During that time, they explored Helena, a rough but growing city that was slowly transforming from mining camp to territorial capital. They ate at cheap restaurants, walked along the creek that ran through town, and tried not to think about what verdict might be waiting for them. On the 3rd day, they were summoned back to the courthouse. Judge Thornton looked even more weathered than before as he read his decision. "This court finds the evidence presented by the defendants compelling and substantial. While the plaintiff claims damage to his reputation, the defendants have demonstrated a pattern of behavior by the plaintiff that substantially supports their claims. Furthermore, the evidence suggests the plaintiff has engaged in systematic harassment designed to force a property sale." Thornton's eyes moved to Griswold. "Mr. Griswold, I am dismissing your lawsuit with prejudice. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Territorial Marshal for investigation into possible criminal charges related to arson and property destruction. The defendants are awarded court costs." Margaret felt her knees buckle. Caleb caught her, his arms tight around her waist, and she heard him let out a breath he'd been holding for days. They'd won. Against all odds, against Griswold's money and lawyer and connections, they'd actually won. Griswold's face was purple with rage as he stormed out of the courtroom. Blackwood followed, already arguing with his client about appeal options. Judge Thornton caught Margaret's eye and nodded once, a small gesture of respect that meant more than any formal words could have. Outside the courthouse, Margaret started laughing, great gasping laughs that were half hysteria and half pure relief. Caleb spun her around right there on the street, both of them grinning like fools. "We did it," she gasped. "We actually did it. You did it. That speech about justice, Margaret, you were brilliant. We were brilliant, together." They celebrated that night at a proper restaurant, spending money they probably shouldn't have on steak and wine and dessert. Margaret felt lightheaded and reckless, like she'd been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale. When they returned to their boarding house, they made love with an abandon that came from victory and relief and the simple joy of surviving another impossible challenge. The trip back to Red Creek took 3 days, and they arrived to find the association had organized a celebration. Half the town turned out, not just association members, but others who'd been quietly hoping someone would finally stand up to Griswold and win. There was food and music and a bonfire that lit up the night sky. Maria Sanchez hugged Margaret so hard she could barely breathe. "You did it, mija. You showed everyone it's possible to win." "We all did it," Margaret insisted. "The association, the testimonies, the support. None of that happens without all of you. Pastor Morrison approached with something that might have been an apology in his eyes. I was wrong about you, Margaret. About what you needed, what you were capable of. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner. You're seeing it now, Margaret said. That's what matters. As the celebration wound down and people drifted toward home, Margaret and Caleb stood in their yard watching the last embers of the bonfire fade to darkness. The ranch stretched around them, still rough, still demanding constant work, but finally, truly theirs. What do you think happens now? Margaret asked. Griswold won't just disappear because he lost one court case. No, but he's been publicly humiliated and put on notice with the territorial marshal. He'll be more careful, more subtle, and we'll be ready for whatever he tries next. Caleb pulled her close, his chin resting on top of her head. Besides, we're not alone anymore. That's what really changed. We have allies, resources, a community that will fight with us. We built something, Margaret said wonderingly. Not just the ranch, something bigger. A movement, maybe. You built it. I just helped. We built it, she corrected firmly. Together. That's the point. Neither of us could have done this alone. They walked into the house hand in hand, past the threshold that had once separated employer and employee, stranger and stranger, convenience and choice. Everything they'd built, the ranch, the association, their marriage, had been forged in crisis and desperation. But standing in their kitchen with summer moonlight spilling through the windows, Margaret realized that crisis had burned away everything false and left only what was real. She'd married Caleb to survive. But somewhere along the way, survival had transformed into something richer and deeper. They'd become partners in the truest sense, equal stakeholders in a shared future that they were building with their own scarred hands. I love you, she said, the words coming easier now. Not because you saved me or because I needed you, but because of who you are, because of who we are together. Caleb's response was a kiss that carried the weight of everything they'd endured and everything they'd yet to face. When they finally broke apart, he smiled, a real smile, unguarded and open, the kind of expression she'd never seen during those early weeks when he'd been just a hired man working for food and shelter. I love you too, he said. My stubborn, brilliant, impossible wife. They climbed the stairs to their bedroom, not separate quarters anymore, but shared space. Shared life. Outside, the Montana night was vast and star-filled, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. She felt safe. Not the false safety of protected ignorance, but the real safety that came from competence and partnership and hard-won strength. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The ranch still needed constant work. Griswold would certainly try other tactics, and winter would come again with all its harsh demands. But tonight, lying beside the man she'd married out of desperation and learned to love through struggle, Margaret finally understood what Thomas had never quite grasped. Security didn't come from sheltering people from hardship. It came from standing beside them through it, treating them as equals capable of fighting their own battles while never having to fight alone. The ranch was saved. The court case was won. The association was strong. But more than any of those victories, Margaret had saved herself, reclaimed her own strength, discovered her own capacity, and built a future on her own terms with a partner who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. She fell asleep smiling, Caleb's heartbeat steady under her ear, and dreamed of spring planting and summer harvests and a future that stretched out bright and hard and utterly, impossibly theirs. August burned hot and relentless across the Montana prairie, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned every task into an endurance test. Margaret stood in the garden at dawn, harvesting tomatoes before the sun could bake them on the vine, and felt the familiar ache in her lower back that had become a constant companion. She was reaching for a particularly ripe cluster when the nausea hit, sudden and overwhelming, sending her stumbling toward the fence. Caleb found her there 10 minutes later, pale and shaking, one hand pressed against her stomach. How long? He asked quietly, kneeling beside her in the dirt. How long what? How long have you known? Margaret looked up at him, seeing the careful hope in his eyes, and realized she couldn't hide it anymore. I wasn't sure. I thought maybe the stress, the court case, everything we've been through, but now you're sure. She nodded slowly. I think so. Yes. Caleb sat back on his heels, his face cycling through emotions too fast to read. Fear, joy, wonder, terror, all of it flickering across his scarred features before settling into something quieter and more profound. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly. Are you happy about it? He asked. Margaret considered the question seriously. She'd lost one pregnancy with Thomas, buried that grief so deep she'd almost convinced herself she didn't want children anymore. The idea of trying again, of making herself that vulnerable to loss, it terrified her. But underneath the fear was something else, something stubborn and hopeful that refused to die. I'm scared, she admitted. But yes, I think I'm happy. Good, Caleb said, his voice rough. Because I'm terrified and ecstatic in equal measure, and I need you to be the steady one for a while. They sat together in the garden as the sun climbed higher, holding hands and trying to imagine a future that included a child. A baby in the house Thomas had built. A child who would never know Thomas but would grow up knowing Caleb as father. The thought felt like betrayal and blessing tangled together, impossible to separate. We can't tell anyone yet, Margaret said finally. Not until I'm further along, not until we're sure. Agreed. Though Maria's going to figure it out the moment she sees you, that woman has a sixth sense. Margaret laughed, then immediately regretted it as another wave of nausea hit. Caleb helped her to her feet, his arms steady around her waist, and guided her back to the house. For the rest of that day, he took on her heavier tasks without comment, working twice as hard to compensate while pretending nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Margaret felt it in the way Caleb watched her now, his eyes tracking her movements with new protectiveness. She felt it in her own body, the subtle shifts and changes that announced this new presence taking root inside her. Most of all, she felt it in the weight of responsibility that settled over both of them. They weren't just fighting for the ranch anymore, they were fighting for their child's future. The heat continued unabated through August. The association held its monthly meeting at the Miller farm, and Margaret forced herself to attend despite the exhaustion that dragged at her bones. Jacob had news that made everyone sit up straighter. Territorial Governor's Office is sending an inspector to investigate Griswold's land claims, he announced. Apparently our court case got some attention in Helena, and there are questions about whether he's been filing legitimate homestead claims or using fraudulent ones to expand his holdings. When? Maria asked. September, supposedly. They're going to review property records, interview witnesses, the whole works. Jacob's weathered face creased with something that might have been satisfaction. Could be nothing, could be the beginning of real legal trouble for him. Or it could make him more desperate, Emma Chen said quietly. Cornered animals are dangerous. She was right to worry. 2 weeks later, the association got word that Griswold had hired a new foreman, a man named Cole Jessup with a reputation for violence. Jessup had worked in Wyoming cattle wars, breaking strikes and intimidating homesteaders, and his presence in Red Creek sent a chill through the community. He's not even pretending anymore, Caleb said after hearing the news. He's bringing in a gunfighter and daring us to respond. What can we do? Margaret asked. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her stomach, a protective gesture she couldn't seem to stop. We stay alert. We document everything, and we make sure everyone in the association knows to travel in groups and keep their properties secured. Caleb's jaw was tight with suppressed anger. Jessup's dangerous, but he's not stupid. He won't make obvious moves that could bring federal attention. He'll look for isolated targets, people he can intimidate without witnesses. The next morning, William Burke's sheep operation was hit. Someone had scattered his flock in the night, driving them into rough country where coyotes and cliffs took their toll. By the time William and his sons rounded them up, they'd lost 30 head, a devastating blow to a small operation. The association responded immediately. Jacob and his sons rode out to help with the search. Maria organized meals for the Burke family. Caleb spent 3 days helping repair William's fencing and setting up better security. It was exactly what the association was supposed to do, but Margaret could see the strain showing. Everyone was stretched thin, working their own properties while trying to defend against attacks that could come anywhere, anytime. In mid-September, Margaret finally told Maria about the pregnancy. They were canning vegetables in Maria's kitchen, the air thick with steam and the smell of tomatoes and vinegar, when Maria set down her knife and looked at Margaret directly. "How far along?" Margaret's hand stilled on the jar she was filling. "How did you know?" "Mija, I've had 6 children. I know the signs. The way you're moving, the green tint around your mouth in the mornings, the way Caleb hovers like you might break." Maria's smile was gentle. "How far? 3 months, maybe? I'm not entirely sure." "And you're terrified because of what happened before." It wasn't a question. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "I can't lose another one, Maria. I can't go through that again." "You might have to," Maria said bluntly, then softened it with a hand on Margaret's arm. "I'm not being cruel, I'm being honest. Pregnancy is dangerous, birth is dangerous, babies are fragile, you know this. But hiding from the fear doesn't make it go away. You face it, you prepare as much as you can, and you trust in God and your own strength." "I don't feel strong. I feel exhausted and sick and terrified all the time." "That's pregnancy, querida. Wait until the 2nd trimester. You'll feel better, and then the 3rd hits and you'll be exhausted again, but by then you're too invested to back out." Maria returned to her canning, her movements practiced and efficient. "You'll be fine. You're tougher than you think, and you have Caleb, and you have all of us. This baby will be the association's first child. Everyone will help." The thought should have been comforting, but Margaret felt the weight of it instead. Another thing to protect. Another vulnerability Griswold could exploit if he knew. She made Maria promise to keep the news quiet for now, at least until the territorial inspector finished his investigation. The inspector arrived in late September, a thin man named Morrison, no relation to the pastor, with sharp eyes and a methodical approach to his work. He spent 2 weeks in Red Creek reviewing property records, interviewing landowners, and documenting the various complaints against Griswold. Margaret and Caleb testified about the harassment, the fires, the systematic intimidation. So did a dozen other association members. Griswold put on a good show, playing the persecuted businessman being targeted by jealous competitors. He had Fletcher and several others testify to his upstanding character. His lawyer Blackwood came back from Helena to help manage the investigation. But Morrison was thorough and apparently immune to charm or intimidation. "I can't tell you what my report will say," he told Margaret and Caleb in a private conversation. "But I can tell you that what I've found is concerning. If even half of what people are telling me is true, Mr. Griswold has been engaged in systematic fraud and intimidation for years. The question is whether I can prove it well enough for territorial prosecution." He left in early October, his wagon loaded with copied documents and pages of testimony. The community held its collective breath, waiting to see what would come of it. In the meantime, life continued with its relentless demands. The fall roundup was approaching, and the association had organized a collaborative effort, everyone pooling labor to move all their cattle to winter pasture in an efficient rotation. It was exactly the kind of cooperation that made the association valuable, but it also meant leaving properties minimally guarded for days at a time. Margaret was 4 months pregnant now, showing enough that she couldn't hide it much longer, but not so much that she couldn't work. She joined the other women preparing food for the roundup crews, while the men, Caleb included, rode out to gather cattle from across the territory. It was hard, dangerous work, and Margaret found herself constantly worried, not just about Griswold and what he might do while everyone was distracted, but about Caleb himself. Roundup accidents happened. Horses fell, cattle stampeded, men got injured or worse. On the 3rd day of the roundup, a rider came galloping into the camp where the women were working. Margaret's heart stopped when she saw the blood on his shirt. "Accident," the rider gasped. "Caleb Hayes got thrown into a ravine chasing down a steer. He's alive but hurt bad. They need help getting him out." Margaret was moving before she fully processed the words, grabbing medical supplies and running for the horses. Maria caught her arm. "You're pregnant. You can't go riding hard into rough country." "He's my husband. I'm going." "Then I'm going with you." They rode out with the messenger, following him to a narrow ravine about 5 miles from camp. Margaret could see the cluster of men at the edge, could hear Caleb's voice, weak but conscious, calling up instructions. Relief flooded through her so intense it made her dizzy. She dismounted carefully and pushed through the crowd to the ravine edge. Caleb was about 20 feet down, wedged against a rock outcropping, His left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Blood streaked his face from a gash on his forehead, and his shirt was torn. But he was alive and awake, and when he saw her, he actually smiled. "Hey there. Sorry about this." "You idiot," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "What were you thinking?" "That I almost had that steer." He winced as someone lowered a rope. Turns out the steer was smarter than me. Getting him out took an hour of careful work. They rigged a harness and hauled him up inch by agonizing inch, while Margaret bit her knuckles to keep from screaming every time he groaned in pain. When they finally had him on solid ground, she knelt beside him and did a quick assessment. The leg was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places. The head wound looked worse than it was. Scalp cuts always bled dramatically, but there could be internal injuries, broken ribs, damage she couldn't see. "We need to get him to town," she said. "To the doctor." "Closest doctor's in Helena," Jacob Miller said. "That's a 3-day wagon ride. He'll never make it." "Then we bring the doctor here." Margaret stood, her mind racing through options. "Emma, you ride to Helena. Tell Dr. Webster we have an emergency, and we'll pay whatever it takes to get him here fast. Maria, help me set up a proper medical camp. We need clean water, bandages, laudanum if anyone has it." Everyone moved to obey, and Margaret realized with distant surprise that they were following her orders without question. She'd become a leader in this community without noticing it happening, transformed from the desperate widow into someone people looked to in crisis. She spent the next hour stabilizing Caleb as best she could. The leg needed to be set, but she didn't dare try without a doctor present. One wrong move could cripple him permanently. Instead, she cleaned and bandaged his other wounds, got water into him, and tried to keep him comfortable while they waited. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, pain and exhaustion taking their toll. During his lucid moments, he reached for Margaret's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The baby," he murmured. "You shouldn't be doing this, too much strain." "The baby's fine. You're the one I'm worried about. I'm too stubborn to die." "Good, because I'll kill you myself if you try." He laughed, then groaned as the movement jarred his broken leg. "Love you, Margaret Ward Hayes." "Love you too, you reckless fool, doctor." Webster arrived 36 hours later, having made the journey in record time. He was an older man with steady hands and kind eyes, and he took one look at Caleb's leg and shook his head. "This is bad. The break's clean, which is good, but it's going to take months to heal properly, and that's if we set it right, and he follows orders about staying off it." The setting process was brutal. Even with laudanum, Caleb screamed when Webster manipulated the bone back into alignment. Margaret held his hand through it, whispering nonsense words of comfort while tears streamed down her face. When it was finally done and the leg was splinted, Caleb passed out from the pain, and Margaret sagged with relief. "He'll live," Webster said, washing his hands. "But he's done with hard physical labor for a while. Maybe 3 months before he can walk properly, 6 before he can work a full day. You're going to need help." Margaret looked around at the assembled association members, Jacob and his sons, Maria and her husband, William Burke, Emma Chen, even Pastor Morrison, who'd ridden out when he heard about the accident. They were all there, waiting to help, ready to step in. "We'll manage," she said. "We always do." They transported Caleb back to the ranch in a specially rigged wagon, moving slowly to minimize jostling. Margaret rode beside him the entire way, monitoring his breathing, checking his bandages, trying not to think about how close she'd come to losing him. When they finally got him settled in their bed, she collapsed in a chair beside him and let herself cry, great gasping sobs of relief and terror and exhaustion. Caleb woke briefly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Hey, we're okay, both of us." "All 3 of us," Margaret corrected, placing his hand on her belly where the baby was just starting to show. "But you're not allowed to scare me like that again." "I'll try to remember that next time a steer decides to commit suicide by ravine." The next weeks were a strange inversion of their normal life. Caleb, who'd been the one doing heavy labor and outdoor work, was confined to bed and then to the house. Margaret, who should have been resting for the pregnancy, found herself managing the entire ranch operation with help from association members who rotated through on a regular schedule. Jacob's sons came to handle the heavy repairs. Maria brought food and helped with indoor work. William Burke moved some of his sheep to their property temporarily, providing both income and an excuse to check on them daily. Even Samuel Fletcher, surprisingly, sent his eldest boy with lumber for winter repairs, perhaps recognizing that the association's success benefited everyone, even those who'd voted against it. Through it all, Caleb chafed at his confinement. He was a terrible patient, trying to do too much too soon, insisting he could manage tasks that would obviously re-injure his leg. Margaret found herself constantly arguing with him, enforcing the doctor's orders and occasionally resorting to hiding his crutches when he was being particularly stubborn. "I'm not an invalid," he snapped one afternoon after she'd caught him trying to carry firewood. "No, you're an idiot with a broken leg who's going to cripple himself permanently if he doesn't follow orders." Margaret took the wood from him and steered him back to his chair. "Sit, rest, let people help you for once." "I'm supposed to be helping you, not the other way around. That's what marriage is, taking turns carrying each other when one of us breaks. Right now, you're broken. Let me carry you." The fight went out of him, and he sank into the chair with a sigh. "I hate this. Hate being useless. Hate watching you work yourself to exhaustion. Hate, I know." Margaret knelt beside him, her hands on his knees. "But you're not useless. You're healing, and I'm not alone. I've got help. We're making it work." "For how long? You're pregnant, Margaret. You should be resting, not running a ranch and taking care of a crippled husband. First of all, you're not crippled. You're injured. There's a difference. Second, I'm pregnant, not dying. Women have been doing hard work while pregnant since the beginning of time. And third, this is what partnership means. We carry each other, always." He pulled her into his lap, carefully, mindful of his leg, and held her close. "I love you so damn much. I love you too, even when you're being impossibly stubborn. Takes one to know one." They sat together as the autumn sun slanted through the windows, and Margaret felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings against her ribs. She gasped and guided Caleb's hand to the spot. "Did you feel that?" His face transformed with wonder. "Is that the baby? Our baby?" For the first time since the accident, Caleb's expression relaxed into something approaching peace. Whatever else was happening, Griswold's threats, the investigation, the constant struggle to keep the ranch running, this was real. This tiny flutter of life was their future taking shape. In late October, word came from Helena. The territorial inspector's report had been damning. Griswold was being charged with multiple counts of fraud related to false homestead claims. There would be a trial in the spring, and if convicted, he could face significant fines and potentially lose some of his land holdings. The news spread through Red Creek like wildfire. The association held an impromptu celebration at the Miller farm, and though Caleb couldn't travel, half the community came to the Hayes Ranch instead, bringing food and music and toasts to justice finally being served. "This doesn't mean he's defeated," Jacob warned during the celebration. "Cornered, maybe, but not defeated. We need to stay vigilant." He was right to worry. 2 days later, Cole Jessup and 3 of Griswold's men showed up at the Hayes Ranch. Margaret was alone. Caleb was inside sleeping off his pain medication, and the association helpers weren't due until afternoon. She faced them from the porch, one hand on the rifle she'd learned to keep close. "Mrs. Hayes," Jessup said, his voice like gravel. "Your husband home?" "He's resting. You want to talk to him? You talk to me first." "That's so." Jessup's smile was cold. "Heard he had an accident. Shame about that. Man with a broken leg can't protect his property very well, can he?" "I protect my property just fine." "You're pregnant." It wasn't a question. Her condition was obvious now. "What are you going to do? Shoot me?" "That'd be murder, and you'd hang. Even if you got away with it, you'd lose the ranch. The baby would be born in prison. A lot of consequences for one trigger pull." Margaret's finger moved to the trigger, but her mind was racing. He was right. Shooting him without clear cause would destroy everything they'd built. But showing weakness would be just as destructive. "I don't have to shoot you," she said calmly. "I just have to hit you. And at this range, with a rifle, I don't miss." She leveled the barrel at his knee. "Your choice. You can leave now and tell Griswold his intimidation tactics aren't working. Or you can push this, and we find out how well you ride with a shattered kneecap." For a long moment, they stared at each other. Margaret could see Jessup calculating odds, weighing risks. His hand drifted toward his own gun, and her finger tightened on the trigger. "Margaret!" Caleb's voice from the doorway, rough with pain and sleep. He was standing, barely, one hand on the door frame for support, his other hand holding his pistol. "Everything under control out here?" he asked, his tone conversational despite the gun in his hand. "Just discussing property rights with Mr. Jessup," Margaret said without taking her eyes off the foreman. "Is that so?" Caleb hobbled forward a step, his face gray with pain, but his gun steady. "Well, Mr. Jessup, let me make our position clear. My wife is the deadliest shot in 3 counties. I'm meaner than a rattlesnake when someone threatens my family. And if you're thinking about trying something, remember, there's 20 families in this association who'll testify they saw you here making threats if something happens to us. Self-defense killings don't lead to murder charges." Jessup's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Finally, he jerked his horse's head around. "You're making a mistake. Griswold's got reach you can't imagine. This association, this legal trouble, it's just making him angry, and angry men do stupid things." "Then maybe he should stop being stupid," Margaret said. "Now get off my property before I forget I'm a civilized person." They rode away, and the moment they were out of sight, Caleb's legs gave out. Margaret caught him, supporting his weight as they staggered back into the house. His face was slick with sweat, his leg obviously causing him agony. "You shouldn't have gotten up," she said, helping him back to bed. "You think I was going to let you face that alone?" "I had it handled." "I know you did, but we're partners, remember? We carry each other." He used her own words back at her, and despite everything, Margaret smiled. That night she lay beside Caleb, listening to his labored breathing and feeling the baby kick against her ribs. Outside, the Montana winter was coming on fast. She could smell snow in the air, feel the temperature dropping. They still had so much to do before the hard cold hit, and Caleb's injury had set them back weeks on winter preparation. But the association would help. They always did now. That was what they'd built. Not just legal alliances or collective bargaining, but genuine community. People who showed up when you needed them, who carried you when you couldn't carry yourself. Margaret placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move. This child would be born into struggle, into a world where people like Griswold tried to crush anyone who stood up to them. But it would also be born into community, into a family that extended far beyond blood, into the fierce solidarity of people who'd learned to fight together. "We're going to make it," she whispered into the darkness, not sure if she was talking to Caleb or the baby or herself. "All of us. Together. We're going to make it." Caleb's hand found hers under the blankets, his grip weak but certain. "Damn right we are," he murmured, too stubborn not to. And lying there in the darkness, with snow beginning to fall outside, and her husband's broken body beside her and her child growing inside her, and threats still circling their property like wolves, Margaret Ward Hayes believed it. They would survive. They would thrive. They would build the future they'd been fighting for, one impossible day at a time. The storm was coming, she could feel it. Not just the winter storm beginning to howl outside, but something bigger. Griswold's final desperate moves, the trial in spring, all the accumulated tension of months of conflict building towards some kind of breaking point. But they'd faced storms before and survived. They'd face this one too, together, and come out the other side stronger. The first snow came 3 days after Jessup's visit, falling thick and silent through the night until morning revealed a world transformed into white. Margaret stood at the window, watching it accumulate, one hand pressed against the cold glass, the other resting on her swollen belly. 6 months pregnant now, moving slower but still moving, still working, still refusing to surrender to either exhaustion or fear. Behind her, she could hear Caleb struggling to navigate the stairs on his crutches. His leg was healing, but slowly, and the Montana winter made everything harder. Cold stiffened joints and made old injuries ache, turned simple tasks into marathons of determination. "Don't even think about going out in that," he said, reading her intentions from the set of her shoulders. "The cattle need to be checked. The chickens need feeding. Life doesn't stop for snow." "I know, that's why Jacob's boys are already on their way over. They'll handle the heavy work." Caleb made it to the kitchen table and lowered himself into a chair with a grimace. "You need to rest, Margaret, for the baby." I've been resting. I'm going insane from resting. You chopped firewood yesterday. That's not the same as resting, and you know it. They'd been having variations of this argument for weeks now, circling the same territory. Caleb worried about her doing too much, Margaret frustrated by the enforced helplessness of late pregnancy. The truth was, they were both struggling with their new limitations, both chafing against bodies that wouldn't do what they demanded. As predicted, Jacob's two eldest sons arrived before breakfast, bundled against the cold and ready to work. They'd developed a routine over the past months, the association members rotating through to help with the Hayes place while Caleb recovered. It should have been humiliating, accepting so much charity. Instead, it had become something else, proof that what they'd built together was real and lasting. While the boys worked outside, Margaret made breakfast for everyone, moving carefully around the kitchen that had become both fortress and prison. She'd learned to navigate her changing body, learned which tasks were still possible and which needed to be abandoned or adapted. But the learning came with frustration and loss. Loss of capability, loss of independence, loss of the self she'd fought so hard to become. "You're thinking too loud," Caleb observed from the table. "I'm thinking about spring, about the baby coming and the trial, and whether Griswold will try something before the weather breaks." "He will. Question is what and when." It was the conversation they'd been avoiding for weeks, but the tension had been building like pressure behind a dam. Griswold had gone quiet after Jessup's failed intimidation attempt, too quiet. Men like him didn't simply accept defeat. They plotted and planned and waited for the perfect moment to strike. "What if he comes during the birth?" Margaret said quietly. "I'll be vulnerable. You'll be distracted. It would be the perfect time. Then we make sure you're not alone. We arrange for Maria and Dr. Webster to be here early. We have association members on watch. We prepare for the worst and hope for better." Caleb reached across the table for her hand. "We've survived everything else, Margaret. We'll survive this too." The winter deepened, December bringing cold so intense it made breathing painful. Caleb's leg finally healed enough for him to walk without crutches, though he still limped badly and couldn't manage heavy work. But even limited mobility felt like freedom after months of confinement, and he threw himself into what he could do: bookkeeping, planning, organizing the association's collective strategy for spring. Christmas came quietly. The association held the celebration at the church, and Margaret was surprised by the gifts, practical things mostly, but given with genuine affection. Baby clothes sewn by Emma Chen, a cradle built by William Burke, preserves and dried meat from Maria. Even Pastor Morrison contributed a small silver cross on a chain, blessed and intended for the baby. "You've become important to this community," he said as he placed it in Margaret's hands. "Both of you. What you've built here, the association, the resistance to tyranny, it matters. This baby will be born into something worth protecting." On the ride home through the frozen darkness, Margaret leaned against Caleb's shoulder and felt the baby kick vigorously, as if responding to the motion of the wagon. "What do you think it is?" Caleb asked. "Boy or girl?" "Does it matter?" "Not to me. Just curious if you have a feeling." Margaret considered. "A girl, stubborn and fierce. She'll have to be growing up in this territory. If she's anything like her mother, she'll be unstoppable." January brought news that Griswold's trial had been moved up to March, the territorial prosecutor apparently eager to make an example before spring elections. It meant less time to prepare, but also less time for Griswold to plan countermoves. The association met to discuss testimony and evidence, everyone comparing notes and building the strongest possible case. "This is bigger than just our community now," Emma Chen said during one meeting. "The territorial government is watching. If we can prove systematic fraud and intimidation, it sets precedent for how land disputes are handled throughout Montana." "Which means Griswold's more dangerous than ever," Jacob countered. "He's not just fighting for his property anymore. He's fighting for his freedom and his entire way of life. Desperate men do desperate things." The warning proved prophetic. In mid-February, during the worst blizzard of the winter, someone set fire to the Miller feed store. The flames were spotted quickly, and the fire contained before it could spread to neighboring buildings, but the damage was extensive. Jacob lost most of his winter inventory, thousands of dollars worth of grain and supplies that couldn't be replaced until spring. The entire association rallied, pooling resources to help the Millers survive until they could rebuild. But the message was clear. Griswold was striking at the association's infrastructure, trying to break their collective strength before the trial. "He's targeting our ability to help each other," Caleb said at an emergency meeting. "The feed store was central to our bulk purchasing system. Without it, everyone has to operate independently again, pay higher prices, lose the advantage we've built." "Then we adapt," Margaret said firmly. She was 8 months pregnant now, huge and uncomfortable, but her mind was as sharp as ever. "We shift to a distributed system. Multiple smaller storage locations instead of one central hub, harder to coordinate but also harder to destroy." It was a good solution, and they implemented it immediately, but Margaret could see the strain showing on everyone's faces. They'd been fighting for almost a year now, and the constant vigilance was wearing them down. People were tired, scared, wondering if resistance was worth the cost. 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Margaret went into labor. It was early, not dangerously so, but earlier than expected. She was in the barn when the first contractions hit, checking on a cow that was also close to birthing. The pain was familiar from her previous pregnancy, that deep pulling sensation that announced the body's determination to expel what it had carried. She made it to the house before her water broke, calling for Caleb with a voice that brought him running despite his bad leg. He took one look at her face and went pale. "How long between contractions?" 10 minutes? Maybe less. "It's early, Caleb. What if—" "No." He gripped her shoulders, his eyes fierce. "No what ifs. We're doing this. You're strong. The baby will be fine. Now sit down while I send for Maria and the doctor." Timothy Miller was dispatched to fetch Dr. Webster from town, while Caleb rode, despite his barely healed leg, to get Maria from her farm. Margaret tried to argue that he shouldn't risk re-injuring himself, but he was already gone, pushing the horse faster than was wise through snow and cold. Maria arrived first, bringing supplies and calm competence. She examined Margaret quickly, then nodded with satisfaction. "You've got time. First babies usually take a while. The doctor will make it." But the labor progressed faster than expected. Margaret had forgotten, or perhaps blocked out, how consuming the pain was, how it narrowed the world to just breath and contraction, and the overwhelming animal imperative to push. Maria coached her through it. Caleb held her hand until she thought she might break his fingers, and outside the February wind howled like it was morning. Dr. Webster arrived when Margaret was already deep in transition, past the point where his presence made much difference. He examined her quickly and gave Maria a nod of approval. "She's doing fine. Keep doing what you're doing." The baby was born as the sun set, entering the world with a furious wail that announced her determination to survive. A girl, just as Margaret had predicted, small but fierce, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. "She's perfect," Dr. Webster said, placing the squirming bundle on Margaret's chest. "Small, but healthy. Good color, good reflexes. You did well." Margaret looked down at her daughter, God help her, and felt something in her chest crack open. All the fear, all the grief from the pregnancy she'd lost, all the terror of the past months, it all crashed over her in a wave so intense she couldn't breathe. But underneath it was something else, something so powerful it transcended language. Love. Fierce, protective, absolute love. "Hello," she whispered to the baby, who had stopped crying and was now regarding her with solemn dark eyes. "Welcome to the world. It's hard and beautiful and terrifying, and you're going to be amazing in it." Caleb was crying openly, his scarred face transformed by wonder. When Margaret offered him the baby, he took her with trembling hands, cradling her like she was made of glass. "What do we call her?" he asked. Margaret had been thinking about this for months. She'd considered family names, meaningful names, names that carried weight in history. But in the end, only one felt right. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." "Hope Hayes," Caleb repeated, and smiled through his tears. "Perfect." The association celebrated the birth with gifts and visits, everyone wanting to see the baby who represented their collective future. Even in the depths of winter, people made the difficult journey to the Hayes Ranch, bringing food and baby supplies and offers of help. But the celebration was muted by reality. The trial was in 2 weeks, and Griswold had been ominously quiet. Cole Jessup had been seen in town making inquiries about who planned to testify, his presence a clear threat. The association was preparing to send a delegation to Helena, Margaret, Caleb, Jacob, Emma, and Maria, among others, leaving their properties vulnerable while they were gone. "I can't go," Margaret said when they discussed it. "Hope is too young to travel, and I'm not leaving her." "Then I'll go and you'll stay," Caleb said. "We need someone to testify about the harassment and the fires. I can do that. We both need to be there. Our testimony together is more powerful than either of us alone." Margaret looked down at Hope, sleeping in her arms. "Maybe Maria can stay with her. Or Emma. Someone we trust absolutely." In the end, they decided on a rotating system. Maria would stay at the Hayes Ranch with Hope and 2 of Jacob's sons for security. The rest of the delegation would go to Helena in shifts, some testifying while others remained to protect the community. It was the best compromise they could manage, though it left Margaret feeling like she was being torn in half. The week before the trial, Harold Griswold made his final play. It came in the form of a legal maneuver, a motion to dismiss all charges based on technicalities and how the investigation had been conducted. His lawyer Blackwood had found some obscure territorial regulation that arguably hadn't been followed properly during the property records review. It was a long shot, but if it worked, it would invalidate months of investigation and send them back to square one. "He's trying to delay," Emma said after reviewing the motion. "Push this past spring elections, give him time to work on territorial officials, maybe get the prosecutor replaced with someone more sympathetic." "Can he actually succeed?" Margaret asked. "Maybe. Depends on the judge, but it means we need to be prepared for the trial to be postponed or potentially dismissed entirely." The delegation left for Helena 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin. Margaret rode in the wagon with Caleb, Hope bundled against her chest in a carrier Maria had sewn. The baby was only 3 weeks old, too young for this journey, but Margaret couldn't bear to be separated from her. If something happened, if Griswold struck while she was gone, she needed her daughter with her. The trip to Helena took 4 days in the winter conditions, each one harder than the last. Hope cried from the cold and the jostling, and Margaret grew increasingly exhausted from trying to care for her in a moving wagon. By the time they reached the territorial capital, she was hollow-eyed and desperate. They found lodging at a boarding house that catered to families, and for 2 days they simply rested and prepared. Caleb reviewed testimony with the other association members. Emma helped them organize their evidence. Margaret fed Hope and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong. The morning of the trial arrived cold and clear. Margaret left Hope with the boarding house owner, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had 7 grandchildren and promised to guard the baby with her life, and walked to the courthouse with Caleb and the others. The courtroom was packed. Griswold sat at the defense table looking confident, Blackwood beside him with stacks of legal documents. The prosecutor was a young man named Davis who seemed overwhelmed by the attention the case was generating. Judge Thornton, the same judge who'd ruled in their favor during the slander case, presided with stern authority. The proceedings began with arguments about Blackwood's motion to dismiss. For 2 hours, lawyers debated obscure points of territorial law while Margaret sat in the gallery feeling increasingly anxious. Finally, Thornton ruled. The motion to dismiss is denied. While there may have been minor procedural irregularities, they do not rise to the level of invalidating the entire investigation. We will proceed with the trial. Griswold's face darkened, but Blackwood simply nodded and prepared for the next phase. The prosecution began presenting its case, calling witnesses to testify about fraudulent land claims, intimidation tactics, and systematic harassment. Margaret and Caleb were called on the second day. Margaret went first, telling the story of the past year, Thomas's death, her desperate marriage, the harassment that had followed. She described the fires, the cut fences, the threats from Jessup. She presented the documented evidence they'd collected, the photographs, the witness statements, and she did it all while maintaining her composure, speaking clearly and firmly despite her exhaustion. Blackwood's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint her as a scorned woman, making up stories to justify her failure as a rancher. He suggested her hasty marriage to Caleb indicated poor judgment and possible dishonesty. He questioned whether a woman could really be trusted to accurately report on complex property disputes. "Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said when he paused for breath, "I'm not a scorned woman or a failed rancher or too simple to understand what's happening in my own community. I'm someone who's been systematically terrorized for refusing to sell property that's legally mine. And if you think being a woman makes me less credible, that says more about your prejudices than my honesty." The gallery murmured with approval, and Thornton's mouth twitched with what might have been a smile. Blackwood, flustered, tried to recover but couldn't regain his momentum. When Margaret was finally dismissed, she felt like she'd been through battle. Caleb testified next, his account corroborating Margaret's and adding details about Jessup's threats and Griswold's known association with violent men. He was calm and methodical, presenting facts without embellishment, letting the evidence speak for itself. The trial lasted 6 days. Dozens of witnesses testified, association members, neutral observers, even some of Griswold's own former employees who'd grown disgusted with his tactics. The prosecution built a damning case of systematic fraud and intimidation spanning years. Griswold's defense was predictable. He painted himself as a successful businessman being persecuted by jealous competitors and troublemakers. He produced his own witnesses who testified to his upstanding character and legitimate business practices. But under cross-examination, many of them crumbled, revealing financial ties to Griswold that compromised their objectivity. On the 7th day, both sides rested. Judge Thornton announced he would deliberate overnight and deliver his verdict the next morning. That evening, Margaret sat in the boarding house room nursing hope and feeling the weight of everything pressing down. They'd done all they could. Now it was out of their hands. "Whatever happens," Caleb said from the window where he stood watching the street, "we've already won. The association is strong. The community is united. Griswold's reputation is destroyed even if he's acquitted. We've built something that will last beyond this trial." "I want justice," Margaret said fiercely. "I want him to pay for what he's done." "So do I. But if we don't get it, we survive anyway. That's what we do." The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. Margaret could feel the tension like electricity in the air as Thornton took his seat. Hope was with Mrs. Patterson again, and Margaret's arms felt empty without her weight. "In the matter of the territory versus Harold Griswold," Thornton began, his voice carrying across the silent room, "this court has reviewed extensive evidence of systematic fraud in land claim filings, witness intimidation, property destruction, and conspiracy to deny citizens their legal rights to property ownership. The evidence presented by the prosecution is overwhelming and corroborated by multiple independent sources." Griswold's face was stone, but Margaret could see his hands clenching on the table. "Therefore, I find the defendant guilty on all charges. Mr. Griswold, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years if you demonstrate genuine reform. Additionally, all property obtained through fraudulent land claims is to be returned to territorial administration for proper redistribution. You are fined $10,000 to be distributed among those you have harmed, and you are permanently barred from filing any new land claims in Montana Territory." The courtroom erupted. People were shouting, some in celebration and some in outrage. Griswold lunged to his feet, his face purple with rage, but the bailiff restrained him. Blackwood was already arguing about appeals, but Thornton silenced him with a gavel strike. "This court is adjourned. Mr. Griswold will be remanded to custody immediately." Margaret felt Caleb's arms around her, felt herself being lifted and spun despite his bad leg, heard his laughter mixing with her own tears. They'd won. Actually, impossibly won. Justice had prevailed, and Griswold would finally face consequences for his actions. Outside the courthouse, the association delegation celebrated with tears and embraces. Jacob was grinning so wide his face looked like it might split. Emma was crying openly. Maria was already planning the celebration they'd hold when they returned to Red Creek. But underneath the celebration, Margaret felt something else. Not just relief, but a kind of stunned disbelief. They'd been fighting for so long, surviving from one crisis to the next, that victory felt surreal. What did they do now that the battle was over? The question answered itself over the following weeks as they returned to Red Creek and life slowly normalized. The association continued meeting, but now they were planning growth and expansion rather than defense. With Griswold's fraudulent land claims being redistributed, several association members were able to expand their operations. The community that had been forged in conflict found new purpose in cooperation and mutual support. Spring came late but welcome, melting the snow and revealing the land beneath. Margaret stood on her porch with Hope in her arms, watching Caleb work in the garden he'd planted. His leg finally healed enough for sustained physical labor. The ranch was thriving now, the cattle healthy, the buildings repaired and improved. They'd even been able to hire a part-time worker, a young man from town who reminded Margaret of Caleb when he'd first arrived, hungry and hopeful and grateful for the chance. "She's going to be walking before we know it," Maria said, joining Margaret on the porch. Hope was 4 months old now, sturdy and alert, constantly reaching for new things. "Don't remind me. I'm not ready for her to be mobile." "You're never ready. They do it anyway." Maria smiled, her weathered face kind. "You've done well, mija. Both of you. Built something real and lasting. And we couldn't have done it without you, without everyone. That's the point. None of us can do it alone. But together, we can do anything." That evening, Margaret and Caleb sat on the porch as the sun set, Hope sleeping between them in her basket. The mountains were purple against the golden sky, and the air smelled of growing things and possibility. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Margaret asked. "The day after we got married, when you made breakfast and I called you by your name for the first time?" "Every day," Caleb said. "Everything changed that morning, even though we were both too stubborn to admit it. I was so scared. Of you, of the marriage, of everything I was risking. And now?" Margaret looked at him, at his scarred face that she'd learned to read like a map, at his capable hands that had worked beside hers for over a year, at the steadiness in his eyes that had become her anchor. Then she looked down at Hope, at the daughter they'd made together, at the future they'd fought for and won. "Now I'm still scared sometimes," she admitted, "but I'm not alone in it anymore. We built this together, Caleb. Not just the ranch, but everything. The association, the community, our family. We built something that matters." "We did," he agreed, his hand finding hers. "And we're not done building yet." No, they weren't done. There would be new challenges ahead, bad harvests and harsh winters, accidents and illnesses, the constant demanding work of keeping a ranch running. Hope would grow up and bring her own complications, her own dreams and struggles. Life in Montana Territory was hard, and would remain hard, no matter how many battles they won, but they would face it together. That was the promise they'd made to each other that desperate morning when Margaret had agreed to marry a stranger for survival. "Let's survive together," Caleb had said, and they had survived, not just survived, but thrived, building something stronger than either of them could have managed alone. Margaret leaned against Caleb's shoulder, feeling his warmth, his solid presence, his love that had grown from practical arrangement to something deep and unshakable. Hope stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds of baby contentment. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, its voice carrying across the prairie that was finally, truly theirs. The wind came down from the mountains, carrying the smell of sage and summer, and Margaret breathed it in deep. This was home. This hard, beautiful, impossible place where she'd learned her own strength and found a partner who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. Where she'd built community out of desperation and turned survival into triumph. "I love you," she said quietly. "I love you too," Caleb replied. "My stubborn, brilliant, impossible wife." They sat together as darkness fell, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, and knew that whatever came next, whatever trials or tribulations or unexpected joys, they would face it the same way they'd faced everything else. Together, with hope growing strong between them and the land they'd fought for, stretched out in every direction, fertile and full of promise. The widow's gamble had paid off. The stranger's oath had been kept. And out on the quiet prairie, beneath a sky clear for the first time in what felt like forever, two people who'd come together out of desperation discovered they'd built something better than survival. They'd built a home, a family, a future worth fighting for. And that, Margaret thought as sleep finally claimed her, was the greatest victory of all.